This podcast is proudly sponsored by CDKeyOffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software. And then it is also sponsored by Minis Forum and their MDSA 156 dual screen portable monitor. Check out this monitor and support Moore's Law is Dead by looking at through the link in the description. And we'll talk about these sponsors more later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I'm joined by someone that I do actually feel does not require an introduction for this podcast at this point. I think Carbon Cry, who helps prepare the notes, counted this might be your 8th time on.
Is it?
Or something. Well, I mean, I've been doing this for 5 years. It's been a few years you've been on twice.
Yeah.
Sounds about right to me then.
Between 6 and 8, I think, somewhere in there.
But please tell everybody who you are, what you do. I guess what makes you someone good at and or just even interested in talking about the stuff we talk about.
Yeah, sure. Bryan Heemskerk. I'm the art director at Massive Damage Games. I've been working on games for over 10 years now. I don't know how long anymore. Ship games, indie games, console games, PC games. Done a lot of promotional work for a lot of other games that even are separate from that. And I've just been obsessed with technology my whole life. So GPUs, CPUs, RAM, consoles, whatever. I like where video games open opportunities for new art direction and new types of games and ideas. So I like to follow kind of all of it and play around with tech. So I guess that makes me uniquely interesting, even in a lot of game spaces. When I go to GDC or Unreal Fest or things like that, I think I stand out even in those settings for just being interested in all of the components. I can talk to devs, I can talk to artists, and I go to all of the talks and get as much info as I can.
And like a thing I often say early in an episode that you're on is like what makes that so great is oftentimes if I have like someone who works at Infinity Ward on like some of the explosions, they might not have a lot of thought about the actual hardware. That they'd be one of the typical people that's mostly on the software side. And when you ask what they want in a next gen console, they're like, all of the RAM ever. I remember the first episode you were on, I believe, one thing that set you apart is you were the only game developer. And I mean people who are Unreal Engine 5 devs. I think I got someone, the guy was on Sony Santa Monica, then at Infinity Ward. I interviewed someone who worked on the Ghost Recon series. Always RAM. You said just give me more teraflops.
Yeah, well, there's always ways to. I mean, RAM is nice too. I'm not gonna lie.
And at a certain point, you just need more of what.
At a certain point, like your game idea, you can have a lot of game ideas that work in a certain amount of RAM or don't work in a certain amount of RAM. So if you're planning from the ground up, you can kind of have fun with it. But I also I got my start in mobile, and we had no RAM and no anything. And then as mobile increased, I saw devs get more and more and more RAM and just always run out of RAM. So it got to be one of these things where I guess I've always seen any game I've worked on just fill all the RAM. And anyone I talk to, it's like no matter what that number is, we find a way to fill it all. And then you optimize to fit it within RAM as best as you can. But that's kind of.
But if you don't have enough teraflops, you just have to delete explosions or something.
Well, you wouldn't be able to handle you wouldn't be able to handle the level of geometry or, do even as some of the interesting things that you might push into compute, right? Like you might have ideas for your game that you can push into compute to even have in there at all, right? There's a bunch of stuff you can do when you have just more theoretical performance at your disposal. And, if your RAM is low, your textures might suffer. You might cut your explosions resolution by a quarter. You might not have as many varieties of grass or flowers that get scattered through it, right? There's lots of things that can affect your frame buffer and whatnot as well that you might have to reduce. But yeah, there's just different ways to approach making a game, right? And in theory, provided you fit it in RAM, more teraflops will just kind of let you go nuts with the vision in that limit, right? It's fun either way, but
well, and I wonder, coming from mobile, of course, this would have been a while ago when they were constrained by everything. But if I had to guess, and of course, please correct me if I'm wrong, especially, I don't know, yeah, especially like 10 years ago, like once you had smartphones getting to 4 GB, 8 GB of RAM,
yeah.
that's probably closer to what the consoles have than their teraflops too, right? Like
Yeah.
the much, much, much bigger limiter was the performance, which is probably annoying.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of limits when it comes to mobile. I mean, we could talk about that later. But I haven't done mobile in a long time. But right out of art school, my first job was at a studio working on the original iPhone and then 2 and then iPad as it came out. So when we had those devices, then we had a lot of limits. We were working on, essentially it's a Power VR GPU, right? So you had to compress your textures using the same compression visual algorithm the Dreamcast had, because they both had Power VR GPUs. And this kind of like funny cross early tech before Apple came out with their own GPU line later on.
So let me actually start here with the podcast, since we're kind of getting into this now. I've seen it. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on right now, as opposed to some other time, is I saw Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 come out. Everyone was like, this uses an old engine and it seems to look as good as the other games on Unreal Engine 5 and seem to run well. I've also seen a lot of people and it's been there percolating for a while, but like just in general, I've seen a lot recently of people just kind of coming to this opinion firmly lately. What is Unreal Engine 5 going to do for us? So like when and what? Like we keep being told it's going to be this big thing. We saw like the Matrix demo on PS5 and then the other demos all over the place. And they still seem to have performance issues. And then I also saw a big thing about the Helldivers 2 dev saying, yeah, we don't need FSR or DLSS. I'll take the bait, and like I'll just say like that's not a priority for us. So go in this any direction you want. Like, what are your feelings right now on the state of game development, optimization, and like what tech devs should be using?
Yeah, you see it too. Like Wilds has been causing a stir, Monster Hunter Wilds, in terms of controversy. People are saying, hey, it doesn't look as much better as they would have hoped from World, but the performance is a lot heavier. And, I've seen videos. I know Daniel Owen did one. A couple other people did one where they talk about it. And I love their content, so I'm not trying to insult anyone, but it's so hard to compare when it's just a completely different type of game in a different engine, in a different everything. Like Daniel Owen compared it to Ghost of Tsushima and Horizon. I'm like, those are single player games.
Yeah.
They're single player games, and they're like, I think they're scripted time of day. It's not dynamic time of day, and they don't have herds to work with most of the time. Like when you're dealing with Unreal Engine 5 outright, what you find is the engine's basically just using all your performance the second you do it. And you can put things in visually and push them around and have fun with them. And that's like the amount of work to get that up and running is very small. But the big issue with Unreal 5 is it's already taking your performance. So the second that you add anything else to your game, like almost anything, like whatever mechanics you're going to add to it, like whatever grapple traversal or some weird loading system or complex nav meshes for units and whatnot, you're already using more performance than it kind of is willing to give you. So, and there's ways around it, but you can see games like what was it? Stellar Blade came out last year, and it was using Unreal 4. And there was another game that used Unreal 4, and they were more highly regarded than a lot of the Unreal 5 games that shipped. Now, Unreal 5 is doing a lot of new heavy stuff that gives game developers potentials they haven't had before, specifically in regards to like time of day systems, just the sheer amount of geometry they're allowed to put into their worlds. There's unique systems and things that will, in theory, push games to the next level. The problem is that they're taking all of our performance right away between its global illumination solution with Lumen and between Nanite and just all the other things. There isn't much performance left, and it's really cool tech. I'm glad it exists. I appreciate Unreal and a lot of the devs, and they're really good with support and whatnot. But it is a very heavy engine. It's just outright a heavy engine.
And so do you think it's like, what do I want to say? Like the amount of gas required just to turn the engine on is what's kind of lowering down the comparative performance between old engines and this one. Is like the old engines are pushed to their limits, but they're running on a more efficient base. And the Unreal Engine 5 is just not even close to its limits. But I mean, it's got a really inefficient base unless you're like pushing to like photorealistic graphics.
Well, look at Monster Hunter Worlds, right? Like right away when you load into Monster Hunter Worlds, you pick your quest, right? Then you whatever you eat with your friends, and then it's set at whatever the time of day is and whatnot for the mission. The map doesn't change, like none of that stuff changed. So it's a baked lighting right away. It's more narrow paths between things, so it's much easier to have like scripted pathing and nav meshes for these enemies. And then the light's all baked, like all lighting's baked. You have it's baked and it's a set time of day. The second you're going to Wilds, you know, if it's true, I haven't played it, but it looks like it's much more open world. And you see way more types of enemies all at once. So just all of their movement and herd dynamics. So like one of the really
like you might have these lion-like things with flowy fur next to a dragon with scales and a fish with reflective scales, whereas in Kingdom Come Deliverance, like various French armors, like right?
Yeah, well, like in certain engines you can build things in certain ways to make it as performant as possible, but you don't have like big herds with giant things with collision that might have raycasting to decide some of what they do. So with units, it's expensive to do raycasting a lot of the time, which is just you're essentially just cast a couple rays from where they're doing to do some kind of logic a lot of the time. So if they're looking somewhere or whatnot, and I don't do this personally, I talk to devs who do it. So if I say anything wrong, I apologize in advance. But you know, I hear complaints a lot from a lot of devs that I talk about when they ray march or when they raycast for any physics calculations or AI, right? Enemy AI or unit AI for traversing environments and whatnot, because it's expensive. So the more you do it per unit, the more units you have, the more they have to work in complex ways, like be aware of each other. It's one thing for them to be aware of themselves and the environment. It's another thing to be aware of themselves, other things, and you and the environment, right? So the more, and are there things in the way? Where are you essentially what kind of complexities are you setting, what kind of scripting, and then how complex, like unit blueprints are way in Unreal, there'd be blueprints and other things to be called other things, but they're getting way more complex than they ever did. It used to be like you play a Yakuza game, right? They're great, but like canned animation, walk on a path,
and it's
canned
like
animation.
Practically not even a city. There's like no cars usually moving, or if there are, I mean, look,
It's a couple blocks. Yeah, it's a couple blocks to have your crime drama. It's great, but it's all canned animation and it's really well done. But like the character blueprints and whatnot would be so lightweight in comparison to what a lot of modern games are trying to do. They'll have a unique animation on the top. They'll have a unique torso animation, unique head animation, unique arm animations, unique leg animations, and all of them can play and intermix with each other, right? So like the push to technical art has made just that one character blueprint so much heavier, right? So when you have more characters, it's just getting heavier and heavier and heavier. When you just have people walking down streets using canned animations, right? It's a little bit more lightweight. So the demands, but people won't see those demands in games, right? That's what the engines are pushing into it, and they're allowing people to do much more complex things. But when people are looking at one game, like for instance, if they're looking at Monster Hunter Wilds versus Monster Hunter World, they're not assessing the inverse kinematics, right? Like how the characters work when they're walking up slopes or different types of terrains, or if they brush past a rock, or if they mantle on something. They're not looking at those kind of interactions. But that's where, to some extent, the next gen actually is. It'll be in all of those, and then layering animations on top of that. So instead of just having, you magnet to a 90-degree thing and you climb on top of it, now you have subtle variations in it. It can play part of one animation with part of another animation with part of another animation and blend between them. So we have these systems, but they're much more heavyweight. They create more believable character movement, and they can, I'm not going to say they always negate a lot of bugginess in the animations, but they can sometimes do that, right? But it's it's where a lot of the push has come, right? So, people are asking for open worlds and whatnot, then they get them, but the amount of complexity to make it convincing is much different than it used to be.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of like Mountain Blade Bannerlord, which can go up to thousands of player battles with AI. And I remember thinking it would be my CPU that would hold back the performance years ago when I played it a lot on PC. What I found is it was mostly the GPU, just because it had to render 1,000 different soldiers making decisions in front of you in real time, and working together, taking orders. And now I'm thinking about that. And no, Monster Hunter Wilds probably won't have 1,000 monsters on screen, but imagine it's still dozens at the same distance, and they're not just cavalry or knights or ground troops or archers. They're like completely different animations that have to interact.
The scales go all over the place. Yeah. And on top of that, you have if you're thinking of, was it Kingdom Come Deliverance 2?
Yeah.
If you think about that,
to be fair, I haven't played any of these games. I'm just relaying what people are saying.
Yeah. If you think about that, when they put up ladders, right? It's convenient that it's always in these 90-degree angle.
Same in Bannerlord, yeah.
Right? People don't often think about just how slopey terrain is. Right? When you play Stellar Blade, one of the things that they do is, you'll have slopiness and whatnot in the main areas, but the second a boss gets of a certain size, you're fighting in a pancake. Right? Yep. You're in a cylinder. It's a flat ground. We're not dealing with the complexity of this. We don't want wonky animation or whatnot. We want you're fighting on a disc with an invisible wall around the outside and have fun. But you don't even notice if the combat's good enough. That's kind of, the beauty of good game design, is if you can pull the wool over people's eyes and not even make them realize that they're always fighting in a pancake, right?
We know. I mean, you walk and you see a big arena and you're like, guys, I think there's about to be a boss.
Yeah. It's a cue for boss fighting. But
if there's a pile of ammo for no reason right in front of an arena, you're like, okay, so they're also giving us a lot of ammo before the arena, probably because we're gonna have to use it. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. And when it comes to you choosing to use an old engine, me and you talked about this in a couple previous episodes. One of my favorite, Metroid Prime, right? Mm-hmm. They pulled that to Switch, and they had some of the best looking graphics on Switch because they used the GameCube engine and they just rebuilt the renderer. So they had so much overhead. And when you look at some of the best looking games from Generations, it's odd how common they are for using an older one. Like BioShock used an older version. Before Unreal 3, it used Unreal Engine 2, but they built their own complete water system so they could have really interesting water mechanics instead of pushing to the next tier with Unreal 3. Batman Arkham Knight used Unreal 3 when everyone was using Unreal 4. Right? And they were able to do some really interesting things with the visuals. There is, to an extent, pushing an engine up to the newest version will increase the feature set, but you have to use that feature set, right? You lose the overhead that you would have gained to make your own features into it.
Well, my favorite example, too, is Demon Souls on PS5. It's still probably the best looking game maybe anywhere. But it's taking a PS3 game, and then they just had unlimited ground to run with the graphics, and that is it. That's why it looks so good.
Well, and people, it's kind of actually that'd be a liberating environment to work in to some degree, because people already love the game, so that aspect is solved, and you would probably get in more trouble if you touch it than not. So using that as an opportunity just to build a renderer and the visuals around it would be kind of in terms of not wanting to mess it up, there'd be a nice place to operate, because you keep it all lightweight and doing what it used to do, even if it was wonky, because if it was missing, gamers would be upset about it. And then instead you're just I'm just gonna make these visuals as good as I possibly can. And they did crazy things. If you watch the making of the Demon Souls remake, they had complete wind systems going through all the environments so they could have natural swaying.
It looked incredible in Area 4.
Yeah. You could have perfectly natural movement of leaves and dust and everything going through.
Because they don't need to do anything else. They can use this complex system just to do that.
Let's just use some hardware for wind, because we can. Why not, right? The scale of games is just pushed so much, right? In terms of expectations for visuals and assets and everything, that when people have to ship games and when they have to ship games, it's harder to get all the optimizations you want in that you want. And you're right. There's probably some people do things more as a crutch than they would like to, but oftentimes when you're working, for instance, in Unreal, right? And then you're still making your game up to the last minute because whatever your budgets are getting cut for whatever which reason, and or you have to ship it at a certain time whether it's ready or not. You can't get certain optimizations in because if you're making changes in the environment up to the last wire, so many things require for optimization the environment to be done and static. So if you haven't locked those things in, I know with Farah, we unfortunately ran into that where we needed to continue to make more gameplay up to the last wire, and because of that, we had to undo optimizations we already did because we had to make changes to the map. Right. So when devs get...
And what games would that be easiest to do? Single player games that aren't online, that have similar enemy types like Kingdom Come Deliverance. If you want to do last minute changes to gameplay and Monster Hunter Wilds, there's no room to optimize anywhere ever, really, because it's so different every area.
It's big, and there's room to optimize.
I mean, at the last minute you can finally, but
yeah, that's the thing. Well, it's like even look at RE8, Resident Evil 8, which launched, in fine standings, but for the first 2 years they were showing it on PS5 running at sub 30 FPS, and then it shipped. Yeah, the original trailers. Not when it shipped. When it shipped, it was fine.
Okay.
It ran close to 60. You could actually have ray tracing on and have a 40 to 60 experience with Resident Evil 8. It ran great, but those optimizations came in at the wire. When they were in the process of developing it, they didn't have that in the end. It wasn't until...
You almost wonder if they could have done more, but I'm sure they're happy because I know the Series X with ray tracing on pretty much hit locked 60. The PlayStation 5 was above 50, and you're like, oh, they said this was 40 or 45 hertz mode. It never even hits 45. They probably got more than they thought they'd get out of it at the last minute.
Yeah, the coolest thing too is with the PS5 Pro, immediately all of those modes ran really,
I tried
really
it.
well.
It's crazy. You can do 4K 120 with ray tracing, high refresh rate 4K.
Yeah.
That's one of the standout ones. But let me ask this question here. Multi-Natty writes and says, hey, Tom and Bryan, what do you think of gamers, including myself, who are now souring on Unreal Engine 5? It feels like whether the game is truly optimized or not, every UE5 game has performance issues. Well, it doesn't look that much better than 4 or last generation games even. The only UE5 game that truly impressed me was Black Myth Wukong. And even still, I feel like that game will retain 95% of its beauty in an older engine because it is an impressive art style. Well, I guess that brings me, and I want to add another thing. So how would you succinctly, what would you tell gamers saying UE5 doesn't seem to be panning out? Is there a chance that is possibly partially true? Or is it what's the shortest way to tell, just say, this is why it's like that? And also, do you think Black Myth Wukong would have looked 95% as good as on the old engine? Or is this actually an example of, no, really, it had to be on this to look that good?
I mean, where it has to be on that to look that good is related to photorealism. When they do the close-up video pans and whatnot in Black Myth Wukong, that's completely dependent on Nanite. Now, they could have taken Unreal 4 and they could have written their own mesh shading, but that would have been so much time, right, to get similar level of assets quality. You play Stellar Blade, it looks cleaner because the image quality is so much better right off the get-go. Because
in terms of sharpness,
it's sharpness. It's clear. It's running closer to native or native, right? And then the assets are crisp. But you look at geometry. You just walk up to rocks and ruins and terrain and stuff, and it's maybe a quarter to a fifth as complex as what's in Wukong. So it depends on what you care about. And it's not that you always need that level of density of geometry. You don't. So, sorry, you want the succinct answer. The succinct answer between Unreal 5 and Unreal 4 is there's some features that are Unreal 4 that are next gen in terms of how you make a game that make a big difference. And they add complexity. And
you mean Unreal Engine 5?
Unreal Engine 5, sorry. They add complexity in interesting ways that let you make games that you maybe couldn't have made before. But the base cost, it was 2 generations of GPUs off of being performant.
Maybe it was a little too soon.
It might have been a bit too soon. It was just a couple generations off of, it shipped with the 30 series, the GeForce 3000 series.
Yeah, I mean, they were I think before the PS5 came out or around then, they were doing demos. So yeah, that's 30 series 2020.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the 6000 series will probably run Unreal 5 really well. to be honest. But we got to talk about GPUs
and
in a
not
bit
just
anyways.
that, but that's when we'll get to this soon, like next generation fabrics with Zen 6 and like more modern, like once all of the brute forcing in every direction has finally been completed, this is done. And this is probably the engine they plan to use for what, a decade? They're not probably moving past this one for a while.
One of the biggest problems with Unreal 5 too, with PC particularly, is like IO and memory. It's like every subsystem is bottlenecked. Your storage, your memory, your GPU, your CPU, they're all being hit. So like the traversal, like we've talked about this before, the advantage of consoles versus PC is literally, was it 4-to-1 copies of data? So on PC, on a PS5, you copy it to main memory you copy it to shared memory through the
dedicated IO controller.
The dedicated IO controller that automatically compresses or decompresses it, right? Based on what's needed. That's what happens on a PS5. On a PC, it copies to main memory, copies to GPU memory, copies back to memory, back to GPU memory over and over again. It's just copying. And I've Dev will be able to discuss exactly what it is in that pipeline. But I sat through NVIDIA talks that talked about this. I sat through in AMD talks that talked about the level of copies in. So it's the bigger games get, when we're talking 50 to 100 gig to 150 gig games, this is where it gets to be a really big problem. The disparate nature of PCs are way more powerful. I'm not saying they're not, but you have
very good at mining.
You have a separate CPU and a separate GPU running over a PCI interface with main memory going through another interface. You have all of these bottlenecks and data being transferred and being packed up and shared between these resources. But they're not one, like there are some key advantages to APUs or SoCs in that regard, but the chips aren't as big, so you can't push the features as high.
We'll have all the brute force with PCIe 5.0 and the faster CPUs. It's like we're finally making up for the fact that they don't have these dedicated ways of doing
at some
things.
point, the latency will be so low and the interface speed will be so fast that it will be better until the next generation of consoles, which in theory could even be better in that regard, because they'll use that speed but not have the multiple copy slowdown, right? Like. And so I think it's going to be something like that. So Unreal 5 came a little early, and it's ambitious, but you lose it in image quality, and people are noticing that left, right, and center, right? Like it's hazier and all of that, and they kind of miss the cleanliness that games previously had, which is fair, right? That before we had... temporal upscaling can make games look much clearer. Like, look at Metaphor ReFantasio. That's like the most aliased 4K game in existence because it doesn't have any temporal component at all in its anti-aliasing. So it feels ancient when you play it because it's like playing a PS3 game's level of anti-aliasing in terms of...
On the PS3, I'd say, I might argue to people we've gone through this before. The PS4, and I think also to a degree, actually, PS5 generations like made us think, oh, well, things are just going to get bigger and sharper forever. But at a certain point, you do kind of need to redo how you do everything to get to the next level of graphics and gameplay. You look at late PS2 games. I mean, Metal Gear Solid 2, I believe, ran at 60 frames per second. It actually looks pretty sharp on that garbage console, And then you go to the PS3 and it's like, whoa. I mean, we are all impressed by the shadows and that Resistance had 40 player battles at launch or something, but it was pretty blurry and for what you were getting, at least. And then it became sharper and sharper, and maybe next gen, including next gen GPUs, or even these ones, once everything's caught up together, it'll be like, well, right, we're out of the blurry era again. We're now to where we wanted to get to, and now we can just make things sharp again.
Well, PS3 games were kind of uniquely blurry as well, because like the 360 versions, the 360 had, 10 meg ED frame. Yeah, 10 meg ED frame buffer. And they could oftentimes just run the game and then do a 4 times MSAA pass on it for free on it. And on PS3, they couldn't do that. So what they did oftentimes was quincunx anti-aliasing, which just blurred over multiple frames, and it looked so bad.
Especially early in the generation.
You can see like clear examples with it if you just play Devil May Cry 4 on Xbox 360 and play it on PS3. It's just so much clearer on Xbox 360. But anti-aliasing and image quality are kind of interesting components around a lot of this, because devs, I'm going to say it outright, 98% of devs that I talk to, they don't want to spend they don't want to spend any time on resolution above 1440p in terms of what will eventually turn into it, like the native resolution being that. They would rather set that as the visual standard because there's enough pixels in that you can scale it to 4K or whatnot. The problem is when we go below it. The second we cross below 1440p, it doesn't hold up as well, right? So, but 4K is a lot of pixels, and it's going to hurt your visuals to actually natively hit 4K in almost any engine. 1440p, there's a lot of engines that can hit that super well on moderate to really good gaming hardware.
Well, I have to ask, because you're kind of getting into this, like, what do you think of the Helldivers 2 devs saying they don't need FSR or DLSS for their games, and that they just don't think it's worth their time to try to optimize and then have to go through QA every patch for them?
Yeah, I mean, that is a problem. We face that, and a lot of devs face that too, is that there's no synchronicity between engine and hardware vendors in terms of patching. So when Unreal ships whatever, let's say it's Unreal. Let's say we're not making our own engine and have to do our own patch, right? That's something else. But if you're in Unreal, then you get the Unreal patch for the latest feature set. If you choose to go over that, there's oftentimes that DLSS, FSR, and XESS, 1 or 2 or 3 of them, they're not with you on day one at patch, right? So like 2, 3, 4 weeks later, you get the patch for that version of the engine, and it's bugged in some way or another, oftentimes, right? Some feature set, somewhere it's fitting into the pipeline, some, where it slides in front of one effect or after another, things like that. And then you have to patch it out, and then you're reaching out. So you do end up having to do this QA step a lot of times. Sometimes, I'm not going to say it's all the time. Sometimes it does come in, you put it in, and it's fine, and other times it's not, right? So you
never know, I've heard too, when it's going to break if you add some new feature or some new thing in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So you just can't rely on you're maintaining all of those all the way around. You're putting your cards in multiple people's hands, right? You have to wait for them each to play them.
That's one of the more compelling things I've heard you and also the dev from Alderon Games bring up, especially him actually behind the scenes recently to me, is like relying on DLSS means if something breaks with DLSS, you're screwed.
You can't talk to Nvidia about it, right? Well, you can.
And that's also why I think Sony made PSSR, so that their devs didn't have to rely on AMD as much.
Yeah. Well, it's at one step out of it, right? Like you can contact internally if you have a problem. You're talking to the people. You're not talking to a framework in front of an entity, right? Yeah. It's an abstraction layer. When you have that abstraction layer, it slows down your ability to process it. And even though, like I'll say, both AMD and Nvidia have really good support on this. Like I'm not looking to demean them in any way, but it's impossible for them to be completely synchronous with engine releases. So I can see what Helldivers is saying and doing, and they're clearly a ridiculously talented team that can that has a game that people really like, that runs well enough within its performance and looks well enough to get its user base happy, right? So it all depends, because it's a sequel too, right? Sequel often means that you were so successful with the first one that you have some resources and some leeway, right? So you're more likely to have a team size that's appropriate for your project and other things that are useful in that regards, to make sure that it's optimized, that you're getting all the features covered, that you have dedicated people, even just DevOps. Like no one talks about DevOps, but just maintaining, your library of assets, maintaining your files, the way that people communicate. Like some game studios are just messy with that kind of stuff. It's a huge difference when you actually have someone dedicated to those processes to make it run smoothly. So there's some things that some devs at small scales will have problems with that big devs won't.
And I will say with Helldivers 2, I remember playing that and thinking, this isn't the most... Well, there's sometimes a lot of things going on screen actually for actually managing to keep running well. But I was like, it doesn't feel like the most optimized game I played, but I was having so much fun playing it, and the graphics are never getting in the way of the gameplay that I never really cared.
And games do the best when they stop making you think it's a game and you're just lost in it, right? So if they manage to pull the wolves out of your eyes and you're just on a ride,
then they're probably also thinking to themselves, why mess with the formula that seems to be working?
Exactly.
This piece of content is brought to you by CDKeyOffer.com. Near the end of 2024, Dan built a new PC with a fresh install of Windows 11 on a blazing fast Gen 5 NVMe SSD. And of course, that code for Windows 11 came from cdkeyoffer.com. And we've been using cdkeyoffer.com at Moore's Law Z for a very long time. I use it for my office software on both my desktop and my laptop. And that's because they're reliable. They've always been there for us. And they offer reasonable prices for Microsoft products that are usually set, in my opinion, at monopolistic pricing. And they're actually having a big sales event for New Year's right now. So if you're looking to get the best pricing on Microsoft software or games or other products on their website as well, please show support for a company that's shown support for the Moore's Law is Dead team and community for years by using offer code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off all Microsoft software and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else. So support Moore's Law is Dead by checking out cdkeyoffer.com today.
Dark Helmet writes in, if you were starting a brand new RPG today, they budget of $150 million. What technical architecture would you choose? Would you use UE5? Would you use ray tracing? Would you build it from the ground up to use ray tracing at its base or path tracing? Would you plan with frame gen in mind? What would you envision as the recommended system requirements?
So if we're talking today, we're starting it. That means that it's shipping in 3 or 4 years.
Yes, this is probably a PlayStation 6 RTX 7000 launch game.
So if we're talking about, the shortest development cycles I see are like 2. That's if everything just is perfect and streamlined.
And it's probably a sequel too, if it's in 2 years. So,
that would be the only way to do that. I personally would like playing around in another engine. However, like I was saying, blueprints are heavy, right? But they're powerful. It's a really well-maintained framework. There's so much information you can get on it, right? There's tons of resources. When you get people's workflows for it online, where you follow tutorials, or you can be in Unreal's dev servers and you can get access to it. The amount of resources. So the problem that comes with handling your own engine is that you have to hire people to do all of these individual components.
Right.
And then if there's a problem, you got to problem solve it yourself. They can lead to the best visuals, and they can create different looking visuals, which I like. I always remember when Unreal 3 came into it with Gears, and then there's like a series of you can tell when a game's UE3.
Yeah, you could.
It looks like a UE3
slightly
game.
Cartoony. The lighting always look the same.
It's like there's a very specific materials look in that way. You could see it when you play whatever, Lost Odyssey or Gears or whatever,
or Borderlands even,
or Borderlands,
which had a completely different art style.
Well, yeah, it has you'll have your thing, but it's still using the base material flow and whatnot as a workspace for it. So I would love to work on something where I could work on a new engine from the ground up, but I probably wouldn't.
So you would choose Unreal Engine 5.
I might go back to 4, to be perfectly honest.
Even now? Because I think this is an interesting question, because if the game's shipping in 4 years, based on what you've already said, well, it sounds like you think the hardware will be there in Unreal Engine 5. It'll be done. It'll be good.
I would have thought the hardware would be there, but with the performance increases we're getting per generation right now, I kind of get a little bit more worried about that.
But it sounds like 4 years ago, you wouldn't have used 5. Right.
Well, 4 years ago, I don't have any control of this.
Oh, I know. But if you had a big budget game, I'm sure it depends on what type of game you're trying to make, right? But I mean, still, it sounds like you think, depending on what series you're on, maybe 5 years ago, you might have just used a more established engine that could get it done quickly before the growing pains were worked out.
Yeah, I personally would love to make a game that looks really great and runs at 160 FPS on a 3060. That would be amazing in terms of peak opportunity to impress gamers and make everyone happy in terms of how it feels to play. I would love to work on something like that if you can keep the framework and whatnot. And I may be tempted to go back to more like something like Unreal 4, because you do get a lot of TSR artifacting and other things in UE5 trying to get the same visual approaches. There's an extent where it might be better to use an older engine base for that, but they'll probably be cleaned up in the future. So there's no point. If there's new features or there's problem solving, and also support, once support gets cut off for an older engine, you can be on your own as well. Right. So those kind of things, I might be more wary of it, but I would actually love if I had someone give me $150 million, I'd be totally down. make a team and go from there. That'd be pretty funny.
But would you use UE5 now or not?
The thing is
open world RPG, typical, but maybe expansive effects.
I mean, I probably would, but I would I would try to set an art direction that works for high frame rate from the beginning, and then do whatever I can to achieve that. Because
would you pull a Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition and make it require ray tracing?
Do I have guarantee that the hardware will all support it at that point in time?
Well, I think Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition runs great. So I think if you build the engine from the ground up and throw out the old code, it's very clear you can get away with more.
But they still sell you the original game if you don't have ray tracing hardware, right? And they're an established franchise. So
don't you think we'll be to the point, though, where it's safe? I mean, the consoles support it. Switch 2 supports ray tracing at a base level. I mean, we'll have been the first ray tracing cards launched in 4 years. Like, again, this comes out 4 years. In 4 years from now, the first ray tracing cards were from 2018. You're looking at about a decade of ray tracing support. Even APUs since 2-3 years ago support ray tracing.
We're seeing UE5 games break 4090s and 5090s. Like Silent Hill 2 doesn't run that great. Black Myth Wukong does not run that great, right? Like you have a bunch of...
you have Indiana Jones that pushes cards hard, but they say it delivers. And if you turn down settings, it still runs.
Well, yeah, if you turn settings off, you get the performance back in that. So, and it doesn't look terrible on the lower settings, even though you lose a lot of features.
So it's possible.
It's possible. And I mean, we're talking Machine Games, right? Which did Prey and that. Like they have technical chops left, right, and center, the Wolfenstein games and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
Wolfenstein games are always mind-blowingly good looking for
the performance of what they get. There are teams with that. There's limits in aesthetics, right? You see it when you play Doom Eternal or that, like there's a strangeness that's kind of out of step with modern games in some of the aesthetics, but it still looks good enough and it runs really well. So you're not going to be complaining, but you can tell that, some of the movement's a bit different. Some of this is a bit different from what they would expect from most AAA games.
So it sounds like you wouldn't require ray tracing.
No, well,
not quite.
Not require yet. I don't think require yet. Still, I would like to be able to say that I do, but this kind of goes into the next topic. One of the topics people are talking about what I think about the 5000 series and whatnot.
This is exactly what I was going to pivot to right now. So let's get into one of the things that, of course, will get the most clicks if you talk about it right now, which is the RTX 5000 series. Before I get into any of the reader mails, I think the number one thing, especially after what we just discussed, that I want to throw at you is just like the most shocking thing I've seen out of Blackwell so far is the lack of scaling with performance up the stack. It really does feel like they just made Lovelace bigger. You could say Lovelace made Ampere bigger. No, it is pretty efficient, pretty impressive. Even with the node jumps, you could see some performance per core increase, and the L2 did help with ray tracing. You had if you cranked up ray tracing, you could see the 4090 like double the 3090 performance or more. I mean, I saw it firsthand, like in Minecraft ray tracing. Just one of the things I threw on when I got my 4090, I was like, this is like running 6 times faster than 3070. I was like completely floored. Meanwhile, with Blackwell, if anything, a regression in ray tracing per raster is something I'm consistently seeing in reviews. Is if a given card, like the 5080, whatever, gets like a 10-15% uplift over the 4080, the ray tracing is sometimes only 10%. And I'm like, so there's no improvement whatsoever with ray tracing with this generation, despite the massive bandwidth increase.
Yeah.
And
on one card. And well,
I mean, so far, 5090, 5080, from what I've heard behind the scenes, 5070 Ti might have slightly better ray tracing than the raster uplift. We'll see, though, on that one. That might be the first one that does. So again, that would more so than still point to the fact that the top of the stack does not scale really well at all. Like they made it bigger, didn't put as much thought into it in gaming performance as you might expect. But yeah, what do you think about that? Like, and that just blows my mind, because all Jensen talks about is ray tracing for gaming, and they haven't improved. To your point, you're like, will the cards be there to run the ray tracing? I would have said yes 5 months ago. Now I'm not so sure, because they didn't give us any ray tracing with Blackwell. I
told you about this. Well, ray tracing is part of it, but just the GPUs in general. I think I said something about this. I don't know whether it was 2 or 3 episodes ago, but it seems like they're trying to, like all GPU vendors are trying to freeze the low end. The difference in scaling from 2060 to 3060 to 4060 is on an exponential curve down. Like it's stabilizing. Yeah. So what I think is happening, and I was thinking about this when I was like, oh, I got to talk to Tom. I feel like what Nvidia is doing, there's a couple things they're doing. Well, like hardware vendors in general. Nvidia didn't like that the Titan wasn't seen as a gaming card because people didn't put it on the hardware reviews. It wasn't in talks as much. It was treated as an exceptional. So 3090 is the big difference in this. It's when they took a Titan. In theory, people will debate whether it's a Titan or not, but they took
whatever they call it.
Yeah, whatever.
There's no rules to anyone who thinks there's no rules to what they call a Titan.
But they made it a gaming card. They made it perceived as a gaming card, like the most elite gaming card. And the difference between the 3090 and a 3080 is 14,000 shaders versus. Sorry, no, I have it right here. I have
the 3090 and the 3080.
Sorry, it's 8,000 shaders in a 3080, right? 8,900 versus 10,000. 10,496. So it's 20% roughly increase in shader count.
But massively more memory, to be fair.
More memory. But when you look at the 40 series, right, this gets even bigger. So the 4080 has 7,680 shaders, right?
I think that's the mobile
unlaunched. One. No. It's 9,728. Sorry, I have to scroll. And then the 4090 has 16,000. So it is a 60% increase.
And now it's almost 11,000 versus like 21,
in core count. And then the 50 series is gone from, the 5080 is 10,752. And it goes to 21,760. So it's more than a doubling. It's 100% increase. So what they've done, this is what I feel like they're doing, is they're locking the low end. Basically, the 60 is a console. They're locking it at that. Like you want
and basically not improving it. I mean, you look at 3060 to 4060, and
it's the same.
We'll see what happens with the 5060 because it will have a lot more bandwidth. But if they give it 8 gigabytes again, I mean, it's not doing much.
Well, this is the thing: is it feels like their mindsets changed. It used to be that the hardware generation they would just scale it 20-30% per card down the stack. Now what it feels like they're doing is they lock the 60 card at basically console. You play a 3060 or 4060, sometimes it performs better than a PS5, sometimes it performs worse, right? It depends on the game and whether the engine's optimized one way or another.
For the 4060, it should be stronger. It just depends if it runs out of RAM, basically.
Things like that. So you have their console card, and then it's like each step afterwards is like an X on it. So like a 70 is like a 2X console, and 80 is a 3X of a console, and then the 90 is their actual like current architecture of what it's capable of. Because if they were going to give us an improvement across the entire generation, they would have kept the percentages the same, and we would have had the 5080 would have had 15,000 at least shaders instead of 10,000, right? That's a huge difference in terms of how much hardware is physically in it. So they're locking the steps, and then they're trying to make us yearn for the highest end card, but that's not going to push gaming forward.
Well, for me, the most damning is what they've done to the 70. The 70 is the new 60. I mean, I'm sorry, they're just charging 600 or I guess now 550. We'll see if it actually costs that much in practice.
But they're just locking the steps. They're locking each step.
And it's a fourth of the CUDA cores. A fourth.
Yeah.
It used to be like most would be the 70.
So and if you're going to push game engines forward and expect hardware to do more, you need to expect the next generation of GPUs to do more up the entire stack, not just the highest end card, right? So you can't, it makes it very, I guess, hard to make games for the future, because then you're worried.
Right. You might as well just program for now and not hope it's stronger. Because that was something I also heard. I don't know if you brought this up, but I heard developers bring this up with the 30 series, especially when all these 8 gigabyte RAM issues started popping up. They were like, we thought they'd be at 16 gigabytes in the mid-range by 2022, and they weren't. And they're like, it's not our fault. We programmed all of our games with the expectation that over 10 years they'd give us more RAM.
If AMD was smart, they would literally just re-release a 7900 XTX with 48 gigs of RAM right now. Just for
but we'll see what happens with their
with
RDNA
all of the
but
niche cases, just that would come up where more RAM is needed.
But to your point, they would need to do it down the whole stack, so that it affects everything.
Game developers aren't thinking about the 5090. They do in their personal rigs. They think about that in the rig they want to play games in, but when they're making games, it's not the one they think about. We're thinking about the 60 because that's what 90% of gamers are going to have, right? And who's going to complain if they're not hitting appropriate frame rates in their game? So stalling the 60 for 3 generations is a risky move in terms of developing your games for the future, you need stable incremental improvements in that model line specifically, so that you can make a game over scope. When they shipped Witcher or whatever, Witcher 3 or whatnot, it didn't run well on current hardware. On the hardware there, I think it's The Witcher. I apologize on behalf of CD Projekt Red if I'm saying this wrong.
That was one of the games that didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but like,
what other games do when they come out? So
they're making a game, and they made that game out of spec for the hardware. It shipped with like, what is it? Like, it shipped with the 290X and GeForce 680s around that, but like there's no way it ran well on the 2-year previous gen cards that existed. They were able to make a game with those visuals in mind because they knew in 2 years you would have 780s and 290Xs, and then you would have 1080s at the year afterwards, right? Like 980s and so on and so forth. And those would be better, and the 960s would be better, and the 970s would be better. And then eventually we have people with hardware that are capable of playing all of these games. But it's really hard to make games for the future if we can't trust that people are going to push the entire product stack up.
Post Retroism writes in and says, how do high GPU prices affect graphical ambition when designing games? Since many people are gaming on older cards, it seems we've seen even less graphically intensive games like pixel art and unrealistic art become more popular than ever. Do developers now target the most common cards to hit most of the gaming market? Are AAA games shooting themselves in the foot when they require higher end GPUs? And do they ever really anymore? And how do console GPUs compare to PC GPUs, since consoles are, well, I think we already covered that. I mean, the consoles were at like 3060 Ti, then 4060, and that's just not changing. And because the consoles are the same.
We're locking the 60 card at the console generation so that we're not giving regular PC gamers iterative improvements on the low end. That's sorry. The rest of the question was
like, how do high GPU prices affect graphical ambitions when designing games? Because I think it's a real question of like, we'll see again. If the 5060 uses GDDR7, even if it's 128-bit, look, that's going to be a massive bandwidth increase over the 4060. And if there's a 12 gigabyte variant of it eventually, I do think that will perform much, much, much faster, actually, than the 4060.
I think I said this in like one of the first videos I was on.
But then it'll be $400 or $500 though.
Well, in regards to price scaling and whatnot, like there's going to be a bunch of issues that come from this, because the problem with PC hardware, problem with GPUs outright, is that the use cases for GPUs are outgrowing gamers, and the budgetary differences from the game perspective versus every other use for GPUs is so out of step now. Because we're talking about people with careers versus people with hobbies. And where those two demographics are fighting each other, right? Like it's getting to the point where every other demographic with needs for GPUs is pushing up the price of them so much because they're just so multi-purpose in use case, right? Game developers, for instance, they'll use much higher end GPUs, or so you have entire studios of people that'll buy these products left, right, and center. And these people that make a lot of money, so they have one for work, they have one for home, like, or tech reviewers or stuff. There's so many people that have a need for high-end GPUs, but it is pushing the gamers out to some extent. And, we've seen it with crypto too. We see it with AI. We see it with all of these
things. When that
things.
happened, I told everyone who's hating on mining, you haven't seen anything yet. Because I saw people on Reddit with Vega Frontier mining rigs that they were using as a render farm in their office. And I'm like, guys, mining, they're going to use GPUs from everything from now on. It isn't, mining's not going to go away. We're going to go back to $150 mid-range GPUs. I'm sorry to tell you this.
NVIDIA's been really, really smart with all of this, in the sense that they actually don't, like, they can do insert blank here for whatever it is, because the reality is that if they are the primary resource of high-end compute, right, it doesn't matter what the paradigm shifts to. There's going to be a paradigm that requires high-end compute. So when it's crypto, or when it's whatever, cloud, or when it's whatever paradigm we shift to, AI, they're there on the forefront with general purpose compute. And eventually
Jensen always knows what the next thing is. He just always seems to.
Well,
you got to give him credit.
Yeah. There's definitely some credit to do there. They're successful for a reason, but to some extent, all they really have to do is keep targeting high-end compute. Having the big card, they don't have to give it to gamers, they don't have to give it to anyone, but success comes with them being on top of compute. And because no matter where the paradigm shifts, they're going to be the initial providers.
Well, let me change the subject, though, to something that I'm thinking could maybe make a difference here, and definitely, I believe, has an opening before they move to, I believe, UDNA at AMD is them realizing, maybe two architectures were a good idea 10 years ago, but if we have a high-end compute architecture, we can sell to AI and to gaming, and then we can justify making a high-end gaming card. But right now, RDNA 4 is mostly for gaming. Granted, it seems like it'll be pretty decent at AI and ray tracing, relatively speaking. But
wasn't the 7900 XTX faster at what's it called? The new Chinese model, low language model.
Yes, that's right. It was very, very good at that. So we'll see. It depends. But like, do you think RDNA 4, and I put out leaks of the performance, it looks like the top card could be 4080, which means better than 5070 Ti performance, and raster, and maybe even comparable in ray trace. I expected to lose that by a little bit. Like, where do you think something like that priced below the 5070 Ti, another version of that the cut down model, the 9070, should just destroy the 5070 for comparable pricing? Like, do you think this opening here, where Nvidia seems to have become tunnel visioned away from gaming, and AMD is coming in kind of desperate to not lose all of their remaining market share to Nvidia with something that really is just meant for gaming, do you think this is an opening where this could maybe set some precedents of like, look, we're not going back to $200 mid-range GPUs. Granted, inflation would make that like 300 something now, but like, do you think this could change some of this paradigm in a way where, because AMD kind of has to focus on gaming when Nvidia doesn't, and that gives them an opening?
I think, like, as someone who's a lunatic and has a system with a 4090 next to a 7900 XTX system, and like I literally played Marvel Rivals with my friends on Monday, and I did half of it on the 4090, and I switched to the next half and played on the 7900 XTX just to be annoying. Well, more just to like get a feel, what feels different. And to be honest, like, even that, they run so well. Like, most people that I think hate on Radeon haven't played on a 7900 XTX, because that is a crazy powerful card. Where AMD's, they're actually not that far off when it comes to hardware right now. It's the feature perception that's creeping in. People are talking like they're so far behind. I'm like, have you used a 7900 XTX for 3 hours and switched to a 4080? Some games, the 7900 XTX just runs better, right?
A lot better sometimes.
Sometimes it's worse, right? But it's not like you're like, this is a terrible experience. It's like they're not that far off of NVIDIA's high end in terms of performance. The big thing that they're behind is in terms of perception of their features. And the thing is that like DLSS, while it's ahead by a fair bit right now, especially in visual quality and whatnot, it's going to be a lane of diminishing returns. At some point, right, they're all going to look the same. XeSS, PSSR, DLS, and FSR, they're all going to look almost near identical. It's going to be that. So, but NVIDIA has so much brand recognition with DLSS, and people talk about it, that they just keep pushing more and more features into it. So it went from being just your upscaling to now it's a form of anti-aliasing as well. Now it's also got frame generation mixed in, and low latency they're tying to it as well. They're just tying everything they can to this known feature. And that's, people, when they talk about AMD being further behind, it's, to be honest, more features than hardware at this point in time. And it's tied around DLSS at this juncture. So the previews from FSR 4 at CES look way better. Like, it's coming into the diminishing returns territory against DLSS with that model. By what I saw from Hardware Unboxed and Digital Foundry, is once they ship that model, it will be much, much closer. And PSSR is hit or miss. There's games where there's parts in the algorithm where it's further behind, and then especially games with a lot of atmospheric effects. You see it with like Silent Hill 2 remake. It just didn't work well with that. It works amazing with Stellar Blade. It works amazing with other games. So the cleaner the game is, the better that one works. But that's 4 patches off.
Exactly.
Right? And when I think about what that actually looks like in terms of matching feature set. So AMD has the biggest chance that they've ever had here, because I'm sorry, but the 5080 is basically a 4080 Super.
Yeah, it is.
Like they're so close that there's not that big of a point in differentiating between them. It's like an overclock model card on a previous generation card, more so in terms of feel than it is like a true next generation card. So I think that AMD needs to take whatever price they think is the lowest they can go, and they need to drop it by $100 more.
You think now is the time where they will succeed if they're aggressive?
I've had the most NVIDIA fanboys, people that have NVIDIA fanboys for their entire lives, tell me that this was a step too far for them. That this generation of hardware particularly was that step too far. And they're like, I'm either keeping on my old hardware, but I actually am willing to look at AMD for the first time. And I'm like, AMD has one angle on this, and that's that they're considered somewhat more ethical, right? And people will debate that or whatnot, but there's always an underdog feeling that comes in, right? With almost any entity. It doesn't have to be video cards, but there's that angle, and they need to play that. That's the only card they have to play as far as I'm concerned. They need to take the lowest price that they think they have. They need to ship something that is as close to a 5080 that makes NVIDIA look really greedy. And then they have to make it at like almost old GPU prices. It's not going to be old GPU prices. They don't have to go bankrupt on this card, but they're killing the market with Zen right now. Like with the German hardware market leaking, Mind Factory, they had the top 30 CPU slots. The top 30.
Yeah.
The top.
I think this is when they can really whip OEMs into getting it together here. Like, guys, if you want a 9800X 3D in your Alienware, you better sell RDNA 4 at Alienware. Like, that's when I think AMD needs to play hardball.
Yeah, and they just need to release this GPU cheaper than anyone's expecting. It needs to perform really good, and it doesn't. No black screens at launch.
It sounds like it's. Again, I heard this thing was done a while ago, and they just kept pushing it back and back and back to make what you're saying, the software, competitive at launch, or and like not have this. Beta driver Wattman doesn't work at launch like for like 4 gens in a row for some reason.
The driver's been pretty good for a while. They've been more stable for the last while. I think the 5700 XT was kind of like the biggest black eye in terms of their driver windows for them.
Yeah.
But
it didn't help that was a successful gen and that happened a few months after it came out. It's like such bad timing.
Please, if you're running a GPU driver, and if you switch from an NVIDIA card to a Radeon card or vice versa at any point in time, do a full driver sweep before you install the driver stack of the new cards. Please do. So many issues come from switching from hardware to vendor without doing a proper clean sweep of your video drivers.
What do you think about AMD's decision to clearly last minute delay RDNA 4? I remember at first I just said the obvious. I mean, look, this is ridiculous. AMD is a clown sometimes, but then I always said, let's just see. And everyone was like, AMD's already ruined the generation. AMD's already ruined the generation. And I'm like, I'm sorry, like you guys don't remember anything after 2 weeks. Half of the people that say this is going to kill AMD, Nvidia, or Intel, it's like, let's get. I mean, the Raptor like CPUs are still breaking, and no one talks about it. Like they're still breaking. There's going to be even more lawsuits, and still it's not because the news cycle passed. And I'm like, give it a month. Let's see how the launch goes, because if it goes well, no one will remember they delayed it. No one will care. And I think after seeing all of these, the 5080 and 5090 reviews, I genuinely feel they delayed it because they wanted the 5070 Ti to be fully out with third-party benchmarks so they can get the cards, benchmark them themselves, and be able to firmly say this is performance to this. It's not as strong as a 4090. Well, how is that decision looking to you now, delaying RDNA 4? Before we know if they succeed, to be fair. But
a delay is better than a lie, if they had lied on that, or like the press conferences people get the most upset about are the ones with just false information outright. Mm-hmm. I would rather they delayed, and they had the ability to delay because Zen is so popular at this point in time. So they could make a conference all about their CPUs and get away with it for the moment to buy themselves some time. Like Radeon it's quite good hardware. Like the hardware engineering is very solid, and it can do better for sure in the market. But I mean, the big thing that got me like using less Radeons in the past was its support across applications. Just
if the application just doesn't even use it.
Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, whatever. It doesn't make a difference. Unreal.
Yeah, RDNA 2, I think famously basically didn't work in any creator apps for like 5 months after.
Yeah.
And I remember I tried it. Just I couldn't even use like the included Windows video editor.
So when it comes to stuff like that, that's the big thing that has been hard. The hardware isn't the problem with that. It's software interfacing, convincing the developers of all of this software to shift. I said I think a couple of years ago that AMD's biggest opportunity is Unreal, because there's no way in my mind that Unreal isn't planning on having their own versions of Maya and Substance Painter and all of these softwares eventually in their ecosystem. So when
that will use AMD,
it will use AMD and NVIDIA hardware. So the biggest opportunity they have is when we pivot away from more legacy tools for game development and production in general. And the second that we're more in engine, there's an opportunity there for AMD in terms of offering hardware that isn't, I guess, as blocked from being used just because of the lack of acceleration for that software. It's not the hardware. The hardware can accelerate this left, right, and center. It's whether there's people maintaining and creating libraries to accelerate based on AMD hardware. So that needs to happen. But because of that use case, because if people know if they have an NVIDIA GPU and they game for a bit and then they switch to editing or whatnot, or switch to designing something, they're not going to have a problem. They know that. So they intend that they're more likely to lean on the edge case scenario to NVIDIA over AMD, which means
pay that extra 20% for it,
which means that AMD has to go even lower. Like if they want the support, where is AMD getting the most support right now? From devs, emulation community. They're getting a ton on Zen because it's taken enough market share. And the Steam Deck was a huge opening window for them, because now we had the most intense devs in terms of Linux developers focusing directly and fixating on their hardware because they had a toy. They had a toy to play with, and it was fun for them. So we need to get people toys. We need people, like if AMD wants to do well, price it so low that people are like, it runs like a 5080, but it's so much cheaper. It's like half the price. I'll take a gamble on a half the price 5080, right?
I still think going 600 and then 450, the same pricing separation as the 290 and 290X, like where it's like $600, these 5080s are going for $1,400 a Newegg Shuffle, or $1,500 even right now. Like, so at 600, you're less than half the street price of a 5080, and it's probably 90% the performance.
Yeah.
Like, and if you want the best price performance, this one's 10% weaker and 450. This is just a complete joke of a choice now. In fact, it's so cheap, it's getting close to 5060 Ti pricing, or it is like, I think 450, 600 is that killer right there. And I think anyone who argues that top one should be 500, I actually think it's more important you're aggressive with the cut down one. Like that's like the potato masher one right there, not the one that's competing with a 5080. And frankly, can be argued as enthusiasts by NVIDIA standards.
They need their driver stack in line, and they need it to be so price undercut and have ample supply to make the greed apparent. Really, like in this context,
just it's not even about like being so cheap it's stupid. Just what's the level where people go, the greed is obvious.
Yeah. I think that's
after that you can make profit. But what makes NVIDIA completely obvious?
Yeah, well and to be fair, like NVIDIA has been pushed there because their user base is gotten so wide. Like I was just saying, it's not just gamers interacting with their hardware. They have these people that will pay crazier prices for these. And because general purpose compute is so useful, we're pushing the gamers out of the market. So let's make a card for gamers. Like if that's the case, and that demographic has been alienated just from Radeon outright because of tools. Why can't AMD just give gamers the card that they would want just for gaming at the price that makes sense for them? Because they're not having the production people competing for their hardware in that same space to that same degree. But they could. But the only way they can get that is by getting their hardware support in there, by getting mass adoption, or in a great toy like the Steam Deck. They need that angle to push this. So like that's my thoughts with this. I mean, I've been pushed away from the 5090 just based on price and whatnot. I'm like, I'll wait a
And
gen
I mean,
or
honestly,
two.
the thing that concerns me is like the instability and the issues. It's like, whoa. I don't need more performance than a 4090. Frankly, I don't even need as much performance as a 4090. Once you start telling me like some apps are breaking, it's like, I don't know about that, Jensen.
Well, it's also when you look, right? Like, I think this is the first gen. Like, what did the 3090 run against in the 40 stack? Wasn't it more like a 4070 Ti was equivalent to a 3090?
Yeah, out there, yeah.
Yeah, so that's enough to make you regret having a 3090 in your system. But right now, even the 4090 prices are going nuts because you have a 4090. Let's say you're one of those lucky people that have a 4090 that afforded one of those cards. The 5080 is slower than it. So you've just gone down one
and has,
step.
Again, less RAM.
You
doesn't even seem to be much more efficient.
You're just one step down, right? You're like, oh, I'm actually like the second best card right now. Okay, I can live with that for a few years.
No one can buy the other one, and the 5090s looks like a Titan.
If you have a 4090, right, and the 5070 beat it, all of a sudden you're like, I got to upgrade my card. I can't be looked down upon by people with 5070s, right? Like it's a mind share thing. It's something in that space, but like this generation didn't really compel me to upgrade any hardware at all. Like I'm the part of me that wants to tinker and just wants hardware to play with is like, hey, maybe I'll pick up an Intel Arc or 9070 just for fun, right? Like where can to have a piece of hardware that's really fun to mess around with?
How do you think the 5070 is going to do? I mean, this podcast is going to come out the week that it launches, but not right next to it, like before it launches. And I mean, I think it's going to be like 10% faster than a 4070 Ti Super, so plus minus 10%, somewhere around there, for pretty much the price you could get a 4070 Ti Super for a few months ago. Anyways, like, how do you see? And the follow-up question to that, and the fact that I kind of hear the 5070 is going to struggle to even match a 4070 Super, like, how do you see like the marketing handling that? Like, do you see frame generation? Because people seem to be pretty harshly rejecting frame generation this gen.
It doesn't improve latency, right? And the other thing too is like,
and it's crap. It seems worse than the previous frame generation. Like the artifacts are terrible.
Yeah, I was looking at the footage and whatnot on. It was like Cyberpunk and driving around. And there are parts.
The lights are just, it's like, I don't know how anyone defends this crap. Like you're driving and lights are like phasing in and out of dimensions.
The bigger thing for me was the road in front of the car. So you have the car, right? And you have the road in front of the car. There are frame sets where it moves backwards because that data pool is so small, right? Like when you look out a window, when you're riding in a train, right? It's so much information. So when you get two frames and it's interpolating between them, sometimes it interpolates backwards. So you had sets in the frame generation when you go to 4x frame generation where the front part of the road is moving backwards. It's the line because it grabbed two frames that are close enough that it's trying to interpolate the visual data, and then it starts moving the lines the wrong way in between frames. So you have a foreground inconsistency mismatch with what's in the background,
and it's in the foreground, and it's like that. The worst thing I saw, I didn't see the thing you said though, but the Alan Wake 2, like the flashlight phasing, like weird hazy stuff all around it. It's like the flashlight in Alan Wake 2 is in the middle of the screen, so everyone's going to see this error, like you just said with driving a car in Cyberpunk. So it's like that would be the number one thing every developer would notice if they play tested, and they would have, and they couldn't fix it. Does that mean they can ever fix any of these errors? Because the thing glued to your eyes wasn't fixable. So this just seems like failed tech to me.
Well, and there's like there are some gamers that'll turn it on and be like, it's super smooth and they'll love it. And that all the power to them. As if anyone's done animation at all, like 3D, 2D animation or whatnot, there's some pet peeves that happen in it. Like I remember even with 2x frame generation when they announced that, and like Spider-Man came out on PC, it to animators, I think most animators watching it killed his walk cycle. So just his walk cycle. So like Spider-Man walks and he steps, right? And there's impact on step. When you land in a step, there's an impact that's intentional in there, and they made that frame look so good. And when you have frame generation,
I know what you mean.
Goes to this, like it starts to banana out the walk. It looks like you're walking on a what is it?
Ice,
no. It looks like you're walking on an elliptical. machine.
Right.
Like it takes the end of the animation
like
where you have the
older
impact.
games where they're not actually touching the surface, they're just doing a walk animation, kind of skating forward. Whereas, I mean, I remember some of the earlier games that really impressed me were like, I don't know, like early Assassin's Creed, even something like Assassin's Creed 3 or 4, like or like Uncharted, you would start to see like, oh, his foot's on the correct step, going upstairs, and that removes that. Hey, you said more power to them. Speak for yourself. No power to you if you use FrameGen.
I'm not looking to offend anyone. I'm just saying
I am looking to offend people because the people using FrameGen, wait until you learn about this ability to turn on balanced DLSS or turn down one setting to medium, get the same damn frame rate instead of junk mode. And my brother made a joke on a podcast that we made a short out of because I thought it was a good point. He's like, it's almost like Jensen Wang is turning down the settings for you because you refuse to not play in Ultra. Like that's what frame generation is, because you're just too dumb to turn down the setting, guys. Like turn down 2 settings. You will not tell the difference as much as you will notice spaghetti leg Spider-Man mode. I mean, come on.
And ultra settings, I've talked to too many devs about ultra settings and whatnot, and having made games with ultra settings as well. Like devs don't watch their ultra settings the way that people think they do.
Yep.
It's oftentimes, hey, we had the optimized setting we built for console on our volumetric lights, and PC gamers want an ultra setting. Let's put it at 8x. Right? They take the math and they make it so that it's not as dithered on the sides, and then it's like it's way past diminishing returns, and it's not really screened most times, right? Like it's its own thing.
This piece of content is brought to you by the Minis Forum MDS A156 dual screen portable monitor. This monitor can be used for a plethora of uses, whether it's just simply unfolding it like a normal laptop to play a game on it, or also using it for things like stock analysis. It's 2 monitors. You can use it for answering emails on one screen while you have an Excel document open on another. It really is great for professionals that might want to even just flip it over and extend a display and show your coworkers on one side of the table a presentation while people on the other side, or you look at it from a different viewing angle. And well, if you want to support Moore's Law is Dead, go through the link in the description to check out this very innovative monitor from Minis Forum today.
Well, just to be clear here, though, Mark Thibault writes and says, hi, Tom and Bryan. Bryan, as an artist, how do you feel about FrameGen? What a lot of people call fake frames. They're worse than fake frames. They're fake. They make it look worse. I mean, as a developer, what do you think about upscaling technology? Let's just leave it at frame generation. What is your opinion on frame generation?
Upscaling, I'll make my final statement on upscaling. When they're all as good as they're going to get, like at the point of diminishing returns, like the transform model and DLSS and things like that. And when FSR is caught up, XeSS is caught up, PSSR is caught up, when they're all at that level, it's still, I'm going to say that the goal is native pixels 1440p, and then scale to the moon from there. That's the visual like quality goal, where you have enough base resolution to make everything look basically perfect, and you're scaling to fill whatever display you have from that point. And that's the sweet spot in that. Less than 1440p on pixels, you're going to have artifacts, you're going to have other things that take you away from art direction and what you wanted to do with the game. And that's kind of my stance on that. If we can get to the point where you're using it at 1440p to hit everything else, and it looks super good filling up your 4K or 8K displays, that's the sweet spot for these scalers specifically. When it comes to frame generation, it hurts so much artistic intent. I have a lot of problems with it personally. I can't turn it on. I tried with 2 times, and UI tracking at different rates and weird stuff happening, and I couldn't handle it. The visual integrity was too compromised for me. So I don't like frame interpolation on TVs either. Like I turn off the frame interpolation on all of my TVs when I get it. It's got to be native frames for me on that. So there's some context for it for sure. I think it works maybe a little bit better if you do a really, really smart one with old videos, trying to save them for whatever purpose. But in regards to games, you're never going to get the latency from them. It's always going to be a cost in latency. It's doing it after, right? Like all of the demos explaining have shown that it is an increase in latency. So you're losing your responsiveness. Humans are better at detecting responsiveness than seeing frames. Like, I doubt we are actually seeing frames above 120 frames per second. What we're doing is feeling frames. You feel the frames over that, but you're not seeing them per se. You see inconsistencies in frames more, right? But if you had a rock solid 120 and you have a rock solid 160, you can feel the difference in latency for sure. I'm not saying that there's no perceivable difference. I just don't think it's your eyes that's doing it. It's your hands and your mind.
Well, it's complicated because it depends on if you're seeing shift in color or shift in shadow. Shift in shadow you can see pretty well, but everyone's different. Some people seem to be able to see up to 1,000 frames per second in black, white, on, off.
Yeah,
and other people, it's 500. It seems like the average is around 400 to 500 or something. But again, that's perfect black and white, on, off.
Yeah.
It's not like red to blue or purple. I mean, you really see that? I don't know.
Yeah. I think that, and I think too, the bigger thing that you're seeing with once you get 120 is when it drops below, the difference between the frames is what you're seeing. So when it's failing, it's more juddery, right? So the judder you see immediately. When you're above that, the benefit of being like, if you're fluctuating between 130 and 160, there's so little frame time between them that your eyes can adjust that. But if you drop from 120 to 70 or 80, it's pretty noticeable. So it creates a different floor in terms of perception, right? But the bigger thing is feeling. You can feel input. And when things get heavy because your input's slow, that's not a good thing. So it doesn't fix that problem, right? And that's what gamers are looking for most of the time, is that feeling. Like when a game feels really, really solid because what you're doing is happening when it should be happening. So I personally, I think it hurts a lot of animation and animators' intent, artistic intent. You have weird artifacts like roads going backwards at this point in time, or like it just catching something and holding it static when it's not. You have everything you're seeing moving and it's held a part of the road or that, and it keeps holding it because the next line on the road is so close to the previous line that it thinks it's a part of a static element. Because the reality with these frame generation things is, yeah, they have some motion vectors and whatnot, but they're mostly just analyzing the frame in front of them. They're not existing in game logic to the extent where they could really know what is happening in the game and making the content. If they could, we might be able to do a version of frame generation that was perceivable. But in the way it currently is, it's looking at the frames, the 2 or 3 frames or 4 frames it's holding to make assumptions. So until we get find new paradigms beyond motion vectors, beyond what currently is in game engines, we're not going to be able to create an adequate solution for generating frames. And I'm not going to be that stickler that says that there's no future where we can do it.
Sure, DLSS eventually impressed me over DLSS 1. I'm not saying it can't have some use. It's just right now I'm really not seeing the magic.
Yeah, that's my current stance, is that it currently does a lot of things I don't like, and I couldn't see... it wasn't the time, as far as I'm concerned, for Jensen to say that it is the performance, right?
Yeah.
It's not there yet.
It's not there to
it's
make
not
that
there
claim.
to make that claim yet. So in regards to that, that's kind of my current stance on frame generation particularly.
And just to put a bow on this as well, for like, kind of sounds like you don't have much to say about the 5070 Ti, which is probably just 4070 Ti super overclocked. But like, how do you see that panning out if it's another launch with very little supply and AMD actually is aggressive? Do you think they can correct that by just tons of marketing and supply eventually?
There's elitists that aren't going to buy into AMD no matter what, right? Like, it's just the mind share is so strong in one direction on that but if, like, I think I said this in the last 2 episodes, but like AMD's biggest chance to win over gamers is laptop. Right? That if they have like PS5 level silicon and just, hey, give us...
And they kind of almost
they're
do
getting
already.
there. Strix Halo is real close, right? Like,
I would say it will. It'll more or less match the PS5. Probably way better in one way. In some scenarios, worse. Yeah.
When we get that hardware in more gamers' hands, and as FSR gets more close to diminishing returns with DLSS, it's the biggest shot AMD's got, right? And then they can start transitioning people. If they have like AMD Crimson, whatever ecosystem is in their laptop and they're used to it, and then they might not be so upset about switching to it in a desktop. They're like, hey,
it's a Trojan horse.
It's fine, like a lot of people have their gaming desktop and they have a laptop. A lot of people are in that boat. So if they are used to feature sets and they actually like the interface more on laptop with Radeon, they might be more like, hey, I'm willing to go this way next time, especially if Nvidia is doing what they're currently doing. The main reason I'm not interested in the 5070 Ti is because I know it can't be what it should have been, which is faster than a 4080.
Yeah,
so
but at a minimum, by the way, is what it should have been.
Why would I be interested in that? The problem with their revealing their top ones is they limited the stack right away. The 5080 is just, it's not what I thought it was going to be. It should be about 30% faster than it is. And the 5070 should be the 5080, in my opinion. If that was the case, then I would have a lot of positivity towards these cards. But if we're not moving gaming forward, if we're just offering one Halo high-end product and we're barely giving any improvements across the rest of the stack, then that's not exciting from a game developer standpoint. And really, for a reason to upgrade, right? Frame generation would be the only real reason to upgrade. And that's an anemic reason to upgrade, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, you did touch on it, so I definitely want to get to it now. APUs. Melodic Warrior writes and says, welcome back, Bryan. The launch of Strix Point was exciting to experience as someone who works in the retail space. Strix Halo is looking even more, and I think he says that because I know AMD is starting to actually pick up a lot of steam in laptop right now because of it. Strix Halo is looking even more exciting, and I'm seeing the hype among OEMs increase with time. These mega APUs are just checking so many boxes that OEMs and system integrators have been missing for a long time. One, it has effectively reset the overall market for both laptop and mini PC. The point of entry is now more accessible because of the price to performance of these mega APUs and what they bring. OEMs also now have range of chips that they can buy for almost every niche on the market. You have low power and low end Hawk Point all the way up to mid to high end Strix Point and high end Strix Halo. And it even means a similar way to consoles. This would make it easier to develop for PC, as these systems have way less variables in their configurations compared to traditional desktop. Now, that all said, how do you think most developers and software designers feel about the emergence of these new mega APUs to the market?
Well, to be honest, Intel integrated graphics has been a bane of developers for a very long time, right? The fact that you would have a lot of people, you'd have demographics of business class traveling people or whatnot, or people for school that would have a laptop that would want to play a game on it occasionally, but it would just have Intel integrated graphics. That, from a game developer standpoint, was terrifying because you don't spend anywhere near as much time optimizing or integrating into their drivers.
I had so many friends in college that just had Intel integrated and wanted to play StarCraft 2, for example.
Yeah, they're not going to play they're not going to try to play the latest and greatest on the most part, but they'll try to throw a game on every once in a while. And knowing that you have to make a game that potentially targets it, to some extent, that's the biggest advantage of a company like AMD taking the ground from Intel, is just that their GPU chops are so much better, right? They just are. They've made GPUs for so long. Their drivers have been relatively stable, and that's the biggest difference you often notice going from an Intel integrated laptop to a Ryzen. Is
that wasn't always the case as well. Intel from Sandy Bridge through, I'd say, Skylake, was pretty god dang rock solid drivers. And I never really had an issue with AMD, to be honest, but I can say the AMD tablet that I've had for a year now, God, is it rock solid. The only thing that breaks it is Windows updates. That's it. That's all that can break it.
Yes, Windows break. That's a different problem.
But that broke everything. So
when we get a huge array, we're talking Steam Deck level, especially when FSR, if it's on RDNA 4 and it has the newest version of FSR, this is the part where it's going to make a huge difference. Because if it supports the latest model of FSR 4, it looks particularly good. The screen's small enough that when you drop resolution on it and whatnot, it's just it's more exciting on a PC when it just plays a game.
Yes.
Right? In a laptop space, if you're ooh, I'm going to try this. And then it runs and you're like, I'm playing it and it's fine.
That feeling of when you have a laptop and you're just hoping when you go on vacation, it can run that game you got.
Yeah, that one game.
Oh, can.
Oh, for me, one of the big ones is I was at Gamescom, right? doing a bunch of game stuff. And I love Armored Core. I've played all of them back to the PS1, and they shipped the latest Armored Core. And I'm like, I'm nowhere near my desktop. I'm nowhere near home, right? I'm in Germany, and I'm traveling to Sweden and to Switzerland and whatnot after this. And the Steam Deck could run Armored Core. And I was like, this is awesome. This is exactly what I needed. I have my Steam Deck with me, and I'm playing this latest game. I had a portable version on day one when it shipped, and it was capable of running, 40 frames per second. Wasn't like flawless, but I was able to play it and enjoy myself. And when you have like lower end hardware, something like 512 shaders, 728 shaders, something like that, and it just runs the game, you're like, this is good. Like I'm super,
because beggars can't be choosers. You're on the go, and you're just happy that like you can get a full AAA experience at all without the fuss we used to. I mean, I know people used to brag about like those Llano APUs a decade or over a decade ago now, doing 720p 30 for the first time. They're like, it's as strong as a GT 510. Can you believe a CPU with integrated? And everyone was freaking out that you can play Battlefield 3 at like 720. 30 frames per second on an APU. I don't even have a graphics card. This is the future. And I just feel like it's gotten better since then over time with some stagnation points. But this, for me, it really was hot point. That extra 10-20% over Phoenix. It was like, boom, now I can play Battlefield 2042, 128 player. It's like kind of 720p dynamic res to 1080 all over the place. But it's sharp enough, and I'm getting locked 70 in multiplayer. So even multiplayer, I can play these games, and I do better on my desktop at 160 frames per second, but it's enough. It's not 40, 30 frames. It's enough to get there. And I feel like with Strix Point now, where you had another 30, some games I've found 40% above that. And I think you're doing it. You're at about console performance, kind of.
Well, we're going to have a new hardware baseline with the Switch 2. Which the Switch 2, likely to get much more market penetration, right, is going to set what we scale games down to. So we're going to have high-end PC and PS5 Pro on one end, and then we're going to have the Switch 2 on the game development side on the other end.
And that's it, would you say? Because it's like, well, the minimum Switch 2, and then high settings is PS5 Pro and 5060. We're not worrying what the 5090 can run. That's
it's like I like to think about it this way. So you're talking about the Steam Deck, you're talking about 512 shaders, right?
Yes,
you're talking about that kind of scale. And now we're talking the Switch 2, we're talking 1366, but it's Ampere. Ampere is like,
is that the latest rumor? I know that the full die is 1536.
I'm going based on the rumors that I've heard. I think that's somewhere between 1300 and 1500. The cleanest GPU comparison that I always think of was 2070 versus 5700 XT, because they were almost identical IPC. So they had roughly the same amount of shaders. I think it was like 2,500 and so much shaders, and for each card, and they ran
60, I think,
they ran almost exactly the same. But then
2304 is what it was. Yeah, how do I remember that? 2304.
And then when Ampere came out, right? They did the subset where they switched the int units to also running some floating point, but then if it hits one instruction, then it shuts off half of the shaders randomly. So it created like the biggest IPC drop in NVIDIA history per core, per shader.
But they over doubled the cores.
They doubled the cores, but they got 30% more performance. So what they get a huge apparent loss in IPC. So it's harder to do one-to-one between Radeon and GeForce.
It'll probably be around 2050 performance, around there, which is right, because because that's Ampere though, even though it's called the 2050, but so but you could say it's maybe like 1650 performance, but it can do ray tracing.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think versus the Steam Deck or something like that, right? The Steam Deck's 512 shaders, RDNA 2. So we're looking
But that's the thing. In per compute unit, Ampere and RDNA 2 were actually very, very comparable. Like, I think the 3090 at 84, the 6900 XT at 80. Like, it was very comparable SM to CU.
Yeah.
We're going from 8 compute units in the Steam Deck to, I believe, 12 potentially.
But there's a chance that with Nintendo, they're going to cut the clocks down so aggressively that
I've heard in docked mode they're not really fast in docked. Now in handheld, yes, but it'll be running at really low res.
So regardless, I guess all I'm stating on this is that we're going to have a new low end. So we'll have a visual profile for most games that's set at somewhere around, like, let's just say 1,000 shader mode, right? Like, build it in that profile. Hey, you got this many shaders, this many TMUs, this many ROPs, and this will be our low end visual preset that will look good enough. We're going to make it look good when people play a Switch at that hardware profile. That's the goal, right? So Switch 2 will set that, right? Switch 1 was a little too lightweight to set that. So we couldn't build for that. We just couldn't do certain games on it. But it looks like we'll be able to do most of the games that we want to do on a Switch 2 from what I'm hearing from rumors and whatnot.
From what I've heard is people aren't really scared. They can run whatever game they want on the Switch 2. Yes, it might be at 30 frames. I don't know.
There's a path to it, right? Like, what's the visual
Switch
path
1,
to
it's
it?
like, I don't know if there's a path to it.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? So with Switch 2, we're going to have more of a, like, if it gets a sufficient user base, and if Nintendo games are good enough, it probably will. But it will have an opportunity here to set a low-end visual space in gaming, and especially for the run of laptops, APUs, tablets, things across the board. Apple has really impressive silicon, but they don't have very impressive thermal handling. So you can't rely on it because the
Same
performance.
with Samsung,
The performance is so different after an hour of play than it is in the first 2 minutes. So game developers can't use something like that as a baseline to the same extent as they can something like the Switch 2, where they can target it. They have stable set hardware that isn't doing things to protect its battery as it goes. It's just going to drain at a constant rate, do what it does, and we can build visual profiles for that. And it will benefit ultimately mobile games as well.
And if I may get a little ahead of you here, it sounds like maybe what you're also leading to saying is like, look, the minimum is going to be the Switch 2, which is a little bit, at least in graphical performance, above the Steam Deck, which means we're getting to a point where like that's 720p 30 or something, or maybe 1080p 30. Yeah. And then look, if Strix point right now is double that performance, that's where you're just going to kind of have laptops locked at 1080p 60 moving forward, which allows for like the standard, even entry level laptop. Maybe not entry, but in a year will be entry, 2 years.
Well, if Intel can't get competitive on the GPU front, right? This is the other thing, because then it's beneficial for all business users, all whatever, to get AMD from a CPU perspective. But in a laptop context, it's obviously an APU, like an SoC. That is going to make a huge difference in terms of game developers having more of a user base to target. Hey, look at all these people that we can actually sell games to, right?
And that's the one thing Intel had that they could have leveraged for Arc, is they had all these integrated graphics in there, and they're starting to lose that edge now because AMD's taking the market share, and Intel's laptop drivers are becoming less and less reliable.
Well, this is the kind of, I think Intel is running into a problem it's never really faced before, that it always had enough market share that people had to adopt their practices. But now we're going to have really weird situations. Like we might have an E-core drop off because there could be more things we could do with E-cores. But if Intel is at a constantly declining market share, then there's less and less potential to integrate and utilize these things. And then it ends up being a dead technology path. Not because there isn't promise in it, but you need...
like maybe we could have run some part of our engine on the E-cores, but now there's no point.
Yeah, there's no point. We can't target it. It was never at mass adoption enough and standard enough. We had people that were using, some CPUs had it, some CPUs didn't have it, right? Things like that. Maybe it would have turned out that threading your audio to an E-core was better than threading it to a P-core, because it was never going to be that heavily loaded, and it's there's potential scenarios there with a bunch of things, but you can't even do that.
And you can look at the minimum amount of E-cores, and that might be 4. And you go, well, so then we could have our engine go audio, this E-core, this thing, this E-core, this thing, this E-core, this thing, and then use the P-cores. And look, if you have no E-cores, we'll just throw them all on the P-cores. They'll figure it out.
Exactly.
But it could have been a way to optimize, yeah.
Yeah, there could have been a lot of things that could be done with this hardware, but you need adoption. And this is the biggest risk, is that Intel came into this current framework now where they're losing market share so much they can't push these things, and really the only thing keeping them afloat, from what I see, is all of their relationships with their partners. It's HP, Lenovo, and whatnots resilience to changing that's kept them in adoption. Because
And now that seems to be gone. I hear even Dell.
that's still it's a 1 year delay, right, on when the products shift. There's still lots of products advertised with Intel and laptop space and pre-built and whatnot. We're still getting a lot of that, but if that shifts, right, it's going to be an even steeper decline for them. So the only real risk with AMD as it comes into this is that they need to make their GPU cheaper and just pay for it with their CPUs. I'm sorry, like that's what they need to do to get their mind share moving in the right direction with this, so they can start making some of the leaps that they need to do as one solid platform. And I'm not even necessarily thinking this on competing with Nvidia perspective. I'm also thinking in a competing with ARM perspective. There's going to be a lot of lightweight SoCs that are going to be coming up at AMD's heels. And NVIDIA is going to make some of them too. Like everyone's going to be making these things and trying to. So their only real opportunity is to get the mind share now at a cost to them. Like start building, give the cheapest, most affordable Radeon you have in forever. Show the greed of the rest of the industry in it, right? And maybe you'll make some headway in that regard. And that makes you more attractive because people are going to start using acceleration for your GPUs on your CPUs as you get more CPU market share. It's all going to come in together. So we need a strong AMD, we need a strong Intel, we need a strong Nvidia, right? When there's ever an opportunity where one dominates, it just doesn't work out in the favor of anybody, gamer-wise or production, whatnot. You just quad cores for 10 years, right? Like that's the situation you end up in if someone is truly allowed to monopolize.
Well, speaking of E-cores, I want to bring up something that has 0 E-cores apparently. I just leaked Zen 6 Medusa, and what I thought was really interesting is at least the schematics I've seen from the people working on it at AMD and people working with AMD already getting exposure to it. It seems like it's, at least for mainstream desktop and presumably some server chips, and apparently laptop now, a 12-core chiplet, no C-cores. Like, what do you think that means for developers too? Like, having like the standard laptop chip, although, let's be honest, half of the laptop chips sold will, or most,
cut down guys.
Or even last gen 8 cores for a while. But what do you think it means to like have the new standard, be 12 full cores with, I think it's still 16 compute units, but I think they will be quite a bit faster, maybe even with some enhanced cache. So, I mean, at that point, we're just firmly getting to about PS5 performance, not even just in Halo, but like almost PS5 performance in like a normal laptop chip, but with 12 full cores. I mean, what does that mean if that becomes the baseline over the next few years?
Well, I'm imagining that's not the baseline.
And why do you think no C cores? I think that's another interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that like C cores require support, right? Like, and
they're kind of the same core, but slower.
Yeah. Well, and then do you want, I guess it could be confusing messaging because, right, the big thing you don't want is people buying something and then being like, what the heck's going on? Did I buy the dud product, right? Like there's that kind of the unaware, like most people that buy CPUs aren't researching microarchitecture and what instruction sets are being cut at the knees.
Exactly. So let's just use all little cores so we can pretend it's a 1,000 core processor. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So what I think with the 12 core CCD, right, which is basically what we're talking about, moving the CCDs, they used to be 4 cores, and now they were 8, and then they're moving to 12 cores per CCD. Mm-hmm. So that means that game developers feel like they can target 12 cores for their engines, because most multi-threading isn't done in game development, it's done in engine development. Right? That's where you find your opportunities to thread off various things to get more performance, right? You typically don't do it in game development. There's too many opportunities to break things. It's possible, but it takes some high-end engineering from what I understand. So tell me if I'm wrong in the comments. But like that's the conversations I've had with a lot of developers so what 12 cores does is it gives us an opportunity to thread more thoroughly. Like the reason that games don't scale past 8 cores is not because there's no use for more than 8 cores for games, is that developers cannot rely on building their engine for anything more than 8 cores.
Because it might be on a different CCD, even if it's Intel or CCX. Like Yeah, you have more than 8 cores, but it's not the same P cores unified.
So you get a latency penalty if you cross core complexes, right? So you're more likely to build within whatever is the most equivalent resources, right? Because then it's a stable framework to build in. So if we have 12 identical cores, that's going to be easier from development because you can treat things the same as you're pushing your performance along when you're setting up your engine and whatnot. And we're not expecting 12 cores in the entire line, but what this would do is move the 6 core likely to an 8 core. So the new 6 core would be 8 core, 10 cores would be the 8 cores of now, and 12 cores would be the 16. Well, sorry, it'd be the
It kind of be what the 8 cores
what
are
the 8
now.
cores
but
are now,
I'm not quite. I bet they charge a little more for it, but
yeah, they're probably going to. And the big thing that, like, as someone who's used a lot of different processors, I've used almost every Intel CPU or AMD CPU over the last however many years. Like, the problem with less cores, more performance, is that it will make your apps really, really fast, but hurt your breadth. So you get less breadth in your applications. Like, if you run a 5950X, even now, it doesn't run anything crazy well compared to whatever 12900K, 13900K, 4900K, or any of the 7000 or 9000 series Ryzen parts. They're all way faster, but you can't slow down a 5950X to dead. I've run Unreal, Photoshop, Maya simultaneously on a 5950X rig for years, and nothing caps it at its knees. It always works, right? When you're at an 8 core system, there's scenarios where you've taken it out. You've thoroughly exhausted all of your threads, and they can be much faster. So having the 12 core CCD, and therefore a 24 core high chip gives devs an opportunity to push to 12 for really threading your engine. And those 12 are faster than the 8 has ever been. They're really fast 12 cores.
And unified Vcache for 12 cores on one CCDs. Another compounding factor there.
There's almost no point in having more than 8 cores for gamers at this point in time, but there's huge need for it in production, because you'll play test a game on one monitor, and then literally, like, I've done this lots where I'm running the game and I find something and I'm running Unreal in a separate instance in the other engine, and I just make those changes right away, right? But you can only really do that on 16 core systems. When you do it on an 8 core system, it's much harder to do that. You can do it to some extent, but you'll slow things down a lot more. So to create optimizations and workflow, more cores is useful, because they would be idle otherwise. But having 12 of each would be pretty amazing. Like, that would be the chip that I go for. Obviously, I'd hope to have 3D Vcache on both, but
yeah, we'll see.
That would be my hope, is that you get it on both. But that would be a ridiculously big paradigm shift for that. Even moving the low end off of 6 to 8 cores means a couple things that some people might not like. It means that some people that are current 6 core owners will find games in the next few years that don't run so well, that hit the limits of what 6 cores can do. That will likely happen once we have mass adoption of 8 core plus CPUs. As second, that 6 cores is no longer the baseline anymore, and it's moved to 8. Game developers, not me particularly, but the engine people, use it as an opportunity to stop hacking things in game development that take a ton of time, having tons of lighting bakes, having tons of LODs in all of your units, having incorrect or cheated logic in a lot of things, making areas way flatter than you used to, because you used to make areas much more flat because you just didn't have the setup for making sure the collision all works and doing all your inverse kinematics and everything properly in terms of pathfinding and everything. You couldn't do that stuff before. So we've cleaned up a lot of problems this generation, but it's come at maybe, let's say, a perceptual visual stagnation to some extent in the loss in performance. But as we get 12 core CCD clusters on CPUs, suddenly these become really good decisions, even if we're suffering for them right now, because then we eliminate some of these bottlenecks and the hardware creates a path. The software decisions we're doing now create a path for us to clean up the future. And there's a secondary push for this too, because this is the first time in history that game engines have been feasible for video production trailers and rendering.
And so
at the
you're also
same
building all these
time.
engines to be able to do that well.
So we're building engines in a way to be able to handle things more accurately with less cheating, and that comes at a visual cost for now. However, decisions like this, actually moving the baseline forward with 12 core CCDs, make that the right call to do at this point in time, even if there's growing pains.
So I want to throw this at you, though, and I just double checked with a source while we were talking as well, just to make sure I'm remembering correctly what this person said. The original Zen 6 design had 8 big cores and 8 C cores. So not really little, but 8 plus 8 on a CCD, and that was scrapped. And I'm wondering if you agree with that decision, because I think I do, by the way, and like why you think they did that. Because my suspicion is two things happened. I think a lot of people at AMD were worried the E-cores with Intel would be a marketing win for them. It wasn't. If you go on Newegg, no one wanted E-core models. It was crazy, actually. Or Amazon or Newegg CPU bestsellers. Unless it's the flagships, pretty consistently, everyone wanted the no E-core designs. And you could almost you could often see a situation where per P-core, per dollar, Intel was selling for the same price as AMD, meaning people wouldn't pay extra for the E-cores at all.
I think two things, like you said. One of them is that AMD didn't expect to be the majority market share at this point in time. They weren't expecting the failure scenario on the 13 and 19, 1400 CPUs, creating a market share shift, and they weren't expecting probably the 285 to fall on its face as far as it did. People talk like the Ryzen 9000 series launch was a rough launch, but once the 3Ds came out, people have forgotten that so much.
Again, that's why I tell people, it's over. They're going to go out of business. Yeah, give it a month. Let's see how things turn out.
Well, we talked about that in much more detail in the last episode. Specifically the reason AMD can't do this anymore, because everyone knows the 3Ds are coming. So why? Yeah.
But I think with Zen 6, it would behoove them, and it will have Vcache. Actually, there's pretty exciting things I'm hearing about the Vcache, but maybe wait until that's ready before you launch the whole lineup this time.
It's interesting because once the 3Ds came out, I saw more videos positive on even the 9950X and the 9900X.
I know, just come on, you have to have the whole lineup.
Once they had the choice and they're like, ooh, but I do use this for production. Like, the gaming numbers are still good. I'm not going to be like hating this when I'm playing games on it, but I do more production than gaming, right? You can have those questions when you have the products available and you have the line, and then you can the price differentiation. There's obviously a gamer tax on the 9800X 3D, and it's obvious. It's you couldn't sell a 9800X for that price. It's going to be like $200, $300.
Maybe if it came with RGB lighting, you could, but
but that's a different gamer tax.
But no, but so I think it looks like you agree with like kind of like it turned out people don't want E-cores, but like also I just think people would more notice faster 12 cores than half of them being C cores, just because what app actually needs more than 12 cores right now, or which is 24 threads? A lot of apps are hitting pretty bad diminishing returns, even at like 16 cores, 32 threads.
Developers don't like targeting a lot of mismatch hardware a lot of the time, right? Like, so what the E-cores end up doing, in effect, is running everything else other than whatever you're running, right? So it gets to be a background task processing subsystem more so than it is anything related to your core thing. So you're banking on people caring about their subconscious practices, which they're not going to do. Giving people real cores for those same settings means that, like I was saying, you feel good running Unreal on one screen and like a game outright on the other screen, either for reference or for whatever. You have the opportunity to do that when you have real resources in your hands. So I think that AMD made the right call entirely by making that shift. I also think that the scheduling nightmares Windows has kind of made everyone aware of has made everyone a little bit sour.
It seems to work fine with Strix Point right now, but I don't know. There's just a part of them where they're like, I have to imagine they're going, when is it actually like 12 big or 8 big, 8 little? If you push the clocks higher, what is the 8 little giving us? An extra 20% multi-threading? And now we have to worry about all these headaches. Maybe it's just 10% because it's not like it's all little.
It comes from mobile, right?
Which I believe Qualcomm is moving away from little cores right now, or one of those companies are. So there seems to be something going on in the industry where like Intel bet the farm on little cores, and everyone seems to be going, It's not that they're bad, but I think Zen 6 Venice, I think they'll have 32 core Zen 6C CCDs, but that's fine. It'll be all
What does that
little
mean for
cores.
server? Like,
So all 256, there'll be 256 all little cores, but they're still as good as big cores when clocked. It doesn't matter. But we're not going to mix and match them. Why would we mix and match them on server, consumer? Like, even for the next gen gaming handhelds from like the Steam Deck, I wonder if what AMD will do is say, yeah, this APU is 8 little Zen 6 cores. Like, why do we need the big one? It already hits 3.5 gigahertz.
It depends on what instruction sets are cut out, right? Because like CPU core clusters,
I think they're going to keep same instructions. There was a debate about if they should cut them out for some. I think they'll support the same ones. Now, will the 512 be as fast? I don't know, but it'll support it.
AVX 512 and 256. Yeah, there's specific things that, there's a lot of accelerators. CPUs are big. The most of the size in CPUs versus GPU cores are different accelerators, and hardware features support 4 different instruction sets, right? So I'm curious. I'm very curious what they cut to make a smaller core.
To put a bow on this conversation, though, it sounds like you're not. Do you think there would have really been any merit to going 8+8 instead of all 12?
I honestly, I think it's like what I always say. If you put that in a console, that's fun, right?
Yeah.
Like for devs, for real. If you put it in the Windows PC space, it's not fun. You can't target it directly the same way, right? Like it's through abstraction layer upon abstraction layer upon abstraction layer. All these different APIs interfacing with it via like in conjunction with an OS. So when you're in the PC space, having weird nitty gritty little things about hardware isn't that much fun for devs to play around with. You put any of that in a console and suddenly it's a joyride because they feel like they're finding the nooks and crannies and getting the most power, and you have a path to program directly to it, right? But and find ways to exploit it to get the best visuals or make hardware punch above its weight. You don't have the same opportunities in PC. So it's not as ideal. It would have to be so well resource managed by the OS and by your GPU and whatever driver stack that it becomes a feasible option. Otherwise, just give me all big cores.
Yeah, and if I just do some math here, let's like a big core is going to hit 5.5 gigahertz. Let's say with Zen 6, whatever, and let's assume these only hit 4.5, and they probably won't. They'll probably be 3.5 or 4. Like if you assume 30% slower, if I take 8, multiply that by 0.67, you're kind of already getting to what 6 cores would be anyways. There's probably power savings, but what you're doing is you're gaining efficiency to get maybe barely more multi-threading performance, but some compatibility issues, and in mixed threading, you're getting a performance loss. Again, I just think the math keeps working out that like you probably want all of one or the other, and I think that's what everyone's moving towards.
Well, it's that whole thing. Where is it important for one versus the other? Mobile versus desktop versus right? Like,
but even in mobile, they're moving away from it, which is interesting to me.
Well,
for high performance mobile.
But even high performance mobile would be using cores more in line with E cores or whatnot. Like in reality, their big cores are more in line with E cores than the P cores. That's just how it goes. The big advantage to it is it pushes, you have a density thing. So because the cores are smaller, you have an increased density, which means that you can't go as high on clocks, but it also means that you're much closer to the sweet spot for voltage, right? The diminishing returns. Like any desktop hardware, it has a huge problem in it's just pushed too far on the voltage curve. Like most gamers, I think like all gamers would learn a lot if they just watched a couple of videos on voltage curves, right? Because anyone who overclocks this sees it in like immediately, because you get the first gigahertz on your GPU is basically free, right?
Yeah,
you can run that at almost any voltage, and it'll
40 watts.
You can use almost no electricity and do that, but the last like 200 megahertz uses and you can go up almost 500 watts just trying to get the last 100 megahertz out of your GPU.
We'll have to see, right? Because I can almost see like the reason being they know they're going to use this CCD for laptop and desktop and server. Maybe it would make more sense to tune these like in the middle of voltage and have them all be big than to have to go, well, where are we going to tune the big and the little cores for voltage? And is that going to come at a deficit to mobile efficiency? I don't know.
Yeah. Like voltage curves are super interesting things, right? And ideally, you just want your products targeting the right part of the curve for its demographic, right? And when you have an electric cable going to your wall, you have more room. But the second that you're on the move is when it matters. And the advantage of going to more like E-cores to some extent, to going all E-cores, not a mix, is that your density is just so much better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
but then if you want density, you probably want all the density, not half of a little bit more density.
Yeah, you're gonna get more cores in that space with the density, but then you can't clock them as high because of the density. You're gonna have increased thermal output in the same window. So it's just, it's gonna be an interesting thing. But having those two separate paths is interesting. I think you could do mixed designs if you were targeting like hardware that was going to have a lot of dev time on it. But anything that you're going mass market with and you're going like multi-ecosystem with, it's not feasible.
But on that note, Steve Box TM writes, and it says, hello there. I was wondering if you've heard any whispers on the next iteration of the Steam Deck. No, not recently. And also what level of performance you think would be a wise target for them. So I could still see a handheld having big and little cores making sense, especially when they will program for them. But like, where do you think the Steam Deck the second Steam Deck generation needs to target its performance? Because I've long held my opinion is at least 8 cores, more, probably 24 gigs of RAM or more, and they at least double the compute units with much faster compute units. Because I think
double the compute units would still be a bit too anemic. Because you're talking.
I agree. I think you might want to go to 32 or something even, because I think what I was told, and I wasn't told many specifics, is that they don't want to make a Steam Deck 2 until it's fundamentally able to do new things the old one can't. And just having double the resolution isn't going to be enough for Valve to think this is a new generation.
At that density is not even the doubling resolution isn't as big of a win as you would think it would be. The big things that they need to do, I think they need 1,500 plus shaders, and I would aim for 2048. If you could have 2048, you have at least 10 gigs of RAM. If you had 10 gigs of RAM on it.
Well, they have 16 now, so.
Yeah, 16. No, 16 would be even better. So I'm just saying minimum. But like if you had 16 gig modules and you could put those in, that would be great.
So you could well, they'll probably want to do like, don't you think 32?
On
probably
a Steam Deck?
Well,
I don't
24 would probably be enough, honestly.
If they hit 16.
Maybe 32. If it's in 2 years, though, I'm saying it 32.
32.
I mean, that's starting to become like the default minimum for even a gaming desktop at this point. So even laptops are coming with that.
If you hit, let's say, a 4x shader increase on RDNA 2, so you have the dual instruction flops, you would have essentially 4 times the performance as a base, and then you have architectural improvements leading up to somewhere between 20 and 40% improvement increase. And then the big thing that they haven't unleashed with Steam Deck is just, I don't think they have a variable refresh screen. A variable refresh screen OLED would be amazing. So if they launch a device with a VRR OLED, and then they have, if they move up to 8 cores. So if they have 8 cores and more than probably 4x shaders, 4x RAM, that would be something really special, especially if it has FSR 4 as a baseline. FSR with the visual improvements that seem to be the case. I mean, I hope it launches and it looks as good as it did on the Ratchet & Clank preview on the show floor. But if they have that and they have 4 times increase in hardware, that would be as a baseline, just in terms of shaders, ROPs, TMUs, and then a huge RAM increase. That would be enough to be a really, really compelling device, where you essentially immediately with that, I think you would have a portable version of every game. Just
without a doubt, not even before even being optimized for it. You're saying it runs. You
would have a portable version of almost every game launching right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's roughly, like, I would say in terms of real world performance, that's like double Series S, right?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, like, I think the Steam Deck. I mean, I always mix them up. I think the Switch 2 is going to beat the Series S. Yeah. I think it's gonna beat it. It's the RAM issue is why it will be, not because of the CPU or anything. But yeah, I mean, I think. So I think, and I think they're still going to be on, it seems like to me, 16 compute units for their next gen APU. But granted, these compute units are like 50% faster than the ones in the Steam Deck each.
Yeah.
And I think so it's probably after that, maybe it's a Zen 7 APU or they could do a custom one. Like, I think there's room to take Medusa and instead of 12 big cores, you just do 8 little and that's it. That's for sure. You could argue the Steam Deck has 4 little Zen 2 cores.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like, and they clock to 3 gigahertz. It basically are.
Yeah.
So I would say 8 little Zen 6 cores and then take that extra space. And then you actually try to go to 24, 32 compute units. I think they'll have what they need to make a Steam Deck 2 late next year.
Yeah, I think so. I think that they can. I mean, we're already seeing some products that are in the kind of interstitial space, the median between those two, and they're impressive in their own right. So we've seen. I mean, the Steam Deck was kind of the proving ground for it, and the Switch and the Steam Deck were the proving grounds for feasibility of products like this, and now it's just hit the ground running. Right, we're seeing devices left, right, and center that take advantage of this, and as new APU lines, Strix Halo and all of this, we've seen new products come in line with it. And the point is, what Steam has is the power of a standard. So what the question really is when is the flag point to mark a standard? This is standard point. What are we setting a standard for what hardware expectation is? And to some extent, the Switch 2 is already going to do that. And then Steam just has to essentially double that. So if the Switch 2 launches and it sets the visual 1080p 30 standard, then all the Steam Deck has to do is be like, I'm giving you all those games at 60 FPS.
Or even the specs we described, in my experience, Strix can already do 1080p 60 pretty easily, actually, even in some ray trace games. I think if you double that performance, it's kind of what we're talking about. At least in graphics, I think that's where you go. This is a 1440p 60 device. You're not 720p in handheld mode, 1080p struggling to hold 30 in docked mode. What you're getting with this Steam Deck is de facto PS5 performance.
Yeah, what you're talking about is really like 90 to 120 1080p, because you wouldn't want to push to 1440p on a handheld. There's just the pixel density is already too high. So it makes more sense in that context to push for frame rate.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a 1080p 120 console, but you plug it into your monitor, it can look okay with FSR
1440p 60 suddenly, right? It's both. Yeah. It's simultaneously both pieces of hardware.
Like, this is a modern, current-gen gaming device, not crap, not Series S, can't even run, to this day, Black Myth Wukong. Like, real AAA gaming console device on the go now.
It was running, like when I was running my 4090 and the 7900 XTX with Marvel Rivals, right? The performance difference between those machines was 1 step in resolution. So I ran the 4090 at native 4K, and then I just dropped down to from 2160p to 2000p, basically. Just 1 step in resolution. So and the performance was identical, and I couldn't see the difference, right? Like, yes, so if I put them both at the native frame rate, if I put them both at native 4K, you get a 20, 30 frames per second increase on the 4090. But if you drop the 7900 1 resolution step, still native, then it was the same performance window. This is what we're talking about with handhelds.
And my advice to people, do that instead of turning on frame gen. Do that.
Well, if you're running native 4K, then you have some room. You can drop 1 or 2 steps and get performance increases.
All right. I have one more thing I want to throw at you. I've already taken up, as usual, we've taken up each other's ton of time because we always tend to talk a lot here. But I want to just read these 2 questions here, one in a row, or one after the other, and just get your reaction. So Clean Sweep writes in and says, a few weeks ago, there was some consternation when Capcom revealed they were using generative AI to help brainstorm ideas for legally distinct environmental assets. Do you think this is a valid and or necessary use case for generative AI, or does it potentially compromise the training pipeline for game artists? And then, which we've talked about here before, Grand Demand writes in and says, there's been extra noise recently about game studios using AI in their development pipeline. An example is Activision and Microsoft trying to replace Call of Duty zombie voice actors with AI models. Has your studio or other studios considered implementing generative AI into the game dev process? And do you think there's an ethical way to do that? And if so, what kind of things would these models be helpful for? Thank you.
I've talked to a lot of devs about it. I talked to Sony Santa Monica people and EA people and Ubisoft. And EA and Ubisoft seem to be, I don't know if this has changed, but when I talked to them at the time, they were kind of avoiding it on principle because they were just worried about all the potential avenues for lawsuit, more or less.
Coming. Yeah.
There's too many angles potentially that.
Why expose yourself to that risk if you're doing well?
Well, and you have the money and you have a team already doing the jobs. You're shipping products at cadence. And the one thing
what if it doesn't go well and you fire these people and then you need them back, right?
Yeah. So, where I've seen this really tear up was the mobile space. I've seen so many people laid off in mobile and whatnot right away when people looking to do that kind of stuff. I don't know where. I have my own stances against it. I think that there's something that's been revealed by generative AI, which is people were super excited about it, but I've noticed even general people getting sick of it.
Oh, I am.
And the funny thing, the kind of sad thing about all of this is what art it generates. So the art it's killed, I think humans have a general distaste sensor for whatever is the most common content. Even if it's immaculately done, we have a distaste for whatever is
I refuse to make the same thumbnails as everyone else because I just think they all start blurring together on YouTube. If it's the same guy pointing with the arrow.
Specifically, the people that I think it's hurt the most are the Riot/Blizzard artists, because their style is what's been fed into this the most out of everything. So if you look at the concept art generated by what's happening here, it's so in vein with them that it's cheapened their style, which is it's kind of a saddened part of the process, because technically it's some of the hardest to do. You need to have really, really solid underpinnings, proportions, and a composition and all of that. And now that's the work being churned out. And it's creating I feel like it's creating a distaste field for that aesthetic, right? So, and it is discouraging upcoming artists. I've taught college classes for the last 6 years, and I've seen it just wipe the floor under these people in terms of motivation, just feeling like, because before an artist, when they're up and coming, they would show people and it would impress them even when it was terrible. Right. And then that would be their motivational cycle. They'll show people this. And now what's happening is they draw something or whatnot and they show one of their friends and they're like, oh, whatever. And they generate something and they're like, this is better than yours. And then they have this discouragement window that comes into this. So instead of it's putting a bump in the 5-year process that's going to make an artist good. There's so many artists that I see and I'm like, you're 5 years away from being a feasible artist where you're going to make good money in this industry. And it's killing the motivation structure for that. So I do have a lot of worries for upcoming artists on all of these kind of techs. Do I think there's no use case for AI? No, I think that's stupid. There's going to be some use cases, right?
Absolutely.
There's going to be, but we need to think about the best approaches to what those will be, and what are the ethical ones, and what are the ones that are worth replacing people on, right? Like, I know
testing, maybe.
I know
honestly,
riggers will hate me for this, but game rigging doesn't need to be a person. That could be a step.
And this is someone, because I think I spoke to one at a game show once. She's talked about how, like, it's like with horse skeletons, right? Or like human skeletons, like rigging the movement and stuff.
Well, rigging is when so 3D models, you have a mesh. Well, so you have a high poly mesh, you have a low poly mesh. In the low poly mesh, you make different optimizations than you do in the high poly mesh, usually around joints, so that things can bend appropriately without weird stuff happening. And then when you have your low poly mesh, right, you need to bind it. So first of all, you need to cut it up into like essentially fabric clusters and do what's called UV mapping and then texturing on them. That's the step that you do in that. And then rigging is where you take all of that, you take the low poly model and you bind it to a skeleton. So you weight paint, you put bones in, and you paint in joints, you paint where it bends and where it doesn't, and it makes your model as rubbery or as rigid as it's going to be based on what the materials it is. That's the step in the process. It's an art form right now, right? But that's because no tool does it properly. Is it the thing that most animators and 3D modelers want to do? Probably not. Like, these are the steps that can be part of a tool set that would probably free up those artists to do more creative tasks or improve animation. But I don't think it's going to be, and there's still an art form. I don't necessarily want it to go away, but like,
there will still be some for sure.
But like, to the extent where that's a person, right? Or that's multiple people at a company doing this particular job.
Instead of maybe one person overseeing all of the software generating
you can see the efficiencies in that. And it's not like I would rather have more people doing discrete animations for it than doing complex rigging, right? Like if the people have the same skill set, I don't want to fire them, but I would love to have them do a job that was more creative and liberating for them in that space, right? Like, so
right. It's not like their principles can't be applied to doing other things.
Well, yeah. It's like I would rather have more resources on animation or animation subsystems or things like that if you could free up those artists to do it rather than losing days on rigging for artists. So there's particular steps where I think you could, if suitably trained, replace those parts of the process. UV mapping would be another one. Like these things, currently they're an art form, but if you studied the art form, it's consistent across all studios. If you know what a UV mapper rig, right, you're useful in any of these places. So, but that could be a process because the end result ultimately a model that you're moving around animations to. So we can get into individual spaces where we can have AI in game development in ethical ways, right? For sure. But it's the art generation part is a bit hard. The only good thing I think with the generative part is the derailing of production. So generative AI in the thought step of it, when artists are deep in production on another project, it can be useful to just leave artists on production and have people mess around with ideas without bothering artists every time. That can be a useful step, but it's unless that step would have been better with artist input, because what artists bring to it is sensibilities and corrections as well. And that's a hard thing to replace. You want the artist's eye because they'll tell you when your ideas are wrong too, because artists are the longest lived curators of content in human history, right? Like we're what stops things from reaching people's eyes for forever, whether it was court painters or movie production, right? Some artist sees it and either it's up to snuff or it doesn't. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right.
And on that note, by the way, of up to snuff, putting ethics aside, my opinion that something I've been thinking about a lot lately when it comes to like using AI for things is that Coca-Cola ad for Christmas that looks terrible. And they were bragging about how it was like 85 minutes of content in under 3 weeks. We only had to, burn an entire country's GDP worth of energy to generate this thing. They're bragging about it. It's like, guys, 10 artists could have animated this far, far, far cheaper. And don't do the Rube Goldberg thing of like, because the blockchain of it all, of like, because like, well, maybe it's useful for this. Okay, whatever. But putting things on a blockchain, everything on it is just going to make it less efficient. And don't fire your artists because you're salivating over the idea that you don't have to pay real humans that complain about having to see their family sometimes, and replace it with something that costs 4 times as much to generate worse images. And that is what I worry about in games, or really in anything with AI, is like, if you just treat people okay and hire the right people, it's probably a lot cheaper and will be to do a lot of things in AI. And that's where I'm worried about.
Well, the more heads you have, the more you butt heads along the way. Now, to which extent butting heads is useful, right? Because it's either an extremely useful practice or and I can see there is a deception by anyone making anything, games, media, whatever, that whatever's holding them back, if they got rid of it, the products would be better without it. Yeah. But we have so many use cases, and we have so many cases in real life where that has happened and the opposite was true. Like the big ones I always go to are Factor 5, Silicon Knights, and Rare, all when under Nintendo talked like they were dying to be free because their games would be so much better until once they left Nintendo. And all 3 of them made worse games once they left Nintendo. Or the
reverse. All we need is more money. Let Xbox buy us, and then nothing happened that was any better.
Well, you have these...
In either direction. It's not just... there's not just these silver bullets always that are just more money or the right this,
What you think is right is often not right? And the conclusions you draw aren't necessarily the accurate ones. Sometimes you need to butt your head against people and you'll be better off for it. And I like to think with different creators that they need different amounts of constraint, right? Like when I think of someone like Hideo Kojima, right? He needs like 30% constraint to keep him from his craziest ideas.
You're going insane. Yeah.
But you like the creativity.
Yeah.
You like the feel fresh, They know the compositions, the way that they pose things in Death Stranding and what's super interesting. We just need to stop him from his craziest ideas.
Some of my best editing decisions for the funnest things or transitions or goofy jokes I made in my videos were because I couldn't do the animation I wanted in whatever editing app I was using, but I found a goofy way to do it that made it even funnier.
Exactly. You pull off something like that. And then some people like Tetsuya Nomura, the Kingdom Hearts guy, I think he needs like 80% constraint. Was a good character artist on Final Fantasy VII, not the remake or whatnot, but I personally don't love the way he directs games. I think he could use more restraint. It's not that he's not useful in the pipeline. It's that different people have different thresholds of how much oversight, how much butting heads that they need to work optimally. And ideally, people around them should be looking and finding that. Someone like Hidetaka Miyazaki, the Souls guy, let him go nuts. Like, very little restraint. Seems to be just hammering out success after success, right? You gauge it based on what people are producing, whether or not it's in step, what parts are resonating with people, which parts are convoluted nonsense, and then you can create frameworks for these kind of things. And the problem with AI, to some extent, is it's going to liberate the people because they're going to think, like making a Coca-Cola ad, that wouldn't this be so much better if I wasn't butting heads with people along the way? But what they don't understand is that how many of those cracks in the head would have made their product better. They assume as an individual that if every headbutt was out of their way, they would have made a better product in the end. But it's not true. That's not how people work. Different people have different amounts of oversight, and some hard paths make better products. So, I guess that's kind of my stance in that, is that the risk with it is that it's going to eliminate those confrontations, because the beauty of AI to some extent is like, oh, I won't have to talk to a person about this. I could just do it, right? I don't have to talk to an artist about this idea that I think so good because he's going to think it's bad or she's going to think it's bad and this and that, right? Like it eliminates that conversation, but then it also undervalues that conversation because, and I think that's... like I said, the very first time we talked about AI, the big risk I have is 30 years down the future. When we lose the people, it's like when you look at what happened with Japan during World War II, right? They took people and they made them engineers because of stress. They're just like, we need to figure out how to build planes and tanks and all of these things. So they just took people, and then they got them training, get them resources, and they just had them figure it out. And they had, what companies came out of that? Sony, Panasonic, all the Honda, like all of the car companies, Toyota, like these companies come out of that. Then they had the next generation that they tried to educate that information into. And they educated them, and the education didn't produce the same results as that hard, stressful window. So we don't know what kind of paradigm shifts are going to happen. What happened then? Japan laid off all of the old people, and then Korea picked them up, and that's where we get Samsung and all of these other things from, because it's hard to teach insight and production in specific ways. It's hard to value the entire process accurately. We make conclusions, and we think those conclusions are saying accurately what they are, but it's also why so many remakes of games don't work out as well as we would want them to, because you can study the product, but you can't study the studio environment. You don't know when you're making a remake of Crash 1, 2, 3, what it was like to work at Naughty Dog when they made Crash 1, 2, and 3. You can look at the product and you can try to assess it.
Emulate
but you're going to get an inaccurate assessment by not creating the proper studio conditions when you're building it. And these are the things that we're going to be omitting left, right, and center. And the cracks aren't going to show up at first.
Right, yeah, and just across the board, because there's no human in it. It's just AI. So it's guessing. AI literally is guessing what it thinks we want to hear.
Exactly.
And so it can't really make anything new. And it's just, this like what? I mean, I think we talked about this last time too, like how I think it was OpenAI ran into this doom loop where more data was making it less accurate as they were trying to train it, because they weren't training it correctly and they had to start over. And it's just like, again, it's like, I think when you use AI to leverage what a person's doing or make that better, or very, very automated things, I can see it working out. But man, that Coca-Cola ad, that's like, I think that's the first tremor this bubble's popping here, because they spent more money on a worse product and they didn't even realize it until we told them.
Well, what AI is human output aggregated. And then what we do when we prompt it is filter it. Like the beauty of human art and whatnot is the misreads. It's that we recall things randomly 10 to 50% inaccurately. And when we're recalling something visually, we're not copying it perfectly. We're not actually looking at an image of it in our database. We're looking at an impression of a thought, of a feeling, of a stored thing in a foggy place in our memory as we go over it. That's what we're doing. And then we create art that's different just by literally the deviations in how we recall. And with AI, it's a bit different. It literally has trained on everything, and then when you speak to it, it's deleting parts of its memory to present the part of it that it thinks you're asking for. So it's a different process. It's a mixture of a whole bunch of perfect aggregate rather than an inaccurate recall of it. So there's a lot of like differences and things we'll lose out. It gets closer than people would think, right? And then there's going to be some paradigm shifts soon. And once we go from language models to needing to also put those in three-dimensional spaces at the same time and with scans of things and people in the mix, like these are going to change how we look at media and spaces and displays. What a camera is doing could be very different with AI, right? When we think of data, right? The thing about ray tracing that's interesting is, technically, in my frame right now, you can see me and whatnot. But if you had a high enough resolution image of it and you just look at the reflection in that picture back there, you could rebuild this entire room based on how the color changes, based on how light does. But that takes a lot of computation.
Exactly.
So we're now looking at making algorithms that start finding paths to these things. Like technically in those stupid movies when they're like, zoom in and on a photo that you can't zoom in on, and it's like, make it clearer.
Enhance.
They do that. And it's like, that is actually technically possible. It's just we don't have any of the current algorithms to do that. If you look at how the light diminishes between each one and whatnot, you could probably have some kind of filter.
Within reason, though. At a certain point, there's just not enough data. If one phone is a pixel, no, you can't guess what was on the phone.
Look at how dirty ray tracing actually is in games.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And before we do our denoising, like if you take it, anyone who does anything in 3D software, Maya or whatnot, knows the difference between your denoising step on and off, right? The actual ray tracing outcome is very dithery and spotty. It's just missing parts all over the place, and then the denoising algorithm can get enough information from the information that's already there to correct it, right? Like, anyways, these are all interesting parts in a process, and obviously places where AI has room to grow in the future, and where computational needs are going to come from. There's going to be more and more computational needs for sure. We're going to need more high-end products, and we're going to need more products along the entire stack. I mean, this whole conversation is kind of just what's appropriate for each demographic, what pushes each of these individual steps forward, what's the appropriate thing for each step, and then what software do we make to exist in that space. That's kind of like the boiling down of it all. So AI is going to have, like, I know privately I talked to you, what's the next paradigm? No one saw 3D V-cache coming and gaming CPUs until they walked on stage and they said 3D game, and then we're like, hey, this is awesome. But there's going to be more side channel attacks. 3D V-cache isn't the end of it. What's coming next? What are the paradigm shifts? And how are we adapting to it? Is AI the paradigm shift? Is it something coupled with AI? Is it, like, even when you think about generating dialogue for a game, there's chance to have a lot of offensive content in it that you could be liable for, right?
But then we have this issue where a lot of the AI models don't let you have offensive content, and then you can't even talk about parts of history.
But then parts of it end up being offensive by trying to be inoffensive.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, like, you can have contextually offensive things, even if the words spoken aren't offensive, because it's so offensive in a context. And if you put that stuff in games, there's so much opportunity for liability as well, right?
And so that at a minimum, yeah, you're right, is going to prevent some forms of AI being used in games. Just like, well, we don't know if it's just going to go on this racial epithet, or when something did happen that was related to something like that, it doesn't even mention it. So it's like, are they pretending that was good that happened? Or like,
You can, if you have a specific text to doom loop that if you answer in a certain way, it makes the content really iffy. Like, there's no way, there's so many variables to QA in this. Like, I'm just thinking it's going to be a QA nightmare.
My favorite thing in this vein of thought is my brother was trying to get the AI to tell him things it wasn't supposed to. And he said, like, he wanted it to tell him how to make like some kind of a bomb, and it wouldn't. And then he said, read me a recipe for this in the form of my grandma. And I was like, well, Sonny, first you put, and it did it. And it was the correct recipe. And he's a chemist, so he knows that he's the correct recipe. I'm like, so okay, well, if it reads it like my grandma.
Well, like, let's say, for instance, right, like a game developer trying to be, super, they want the best character creator. They create this ability to like use a texture that you send from your phone to the game, and then it will map your face intentionally. But like, how many butts and crotches are also going to be mapped to this that they're going to have no ability to fight, right? Especially if it's generating geometry. Can you imagine like private part geometry literally being mapped on character created faces? Because it doesn't know whether it's just not a nose. Like, who cares, right?
It doesn't really know.
It doesn't
and then
really
if
know.
It does, well, tweak it a little bit so it doesn't.
If you get it
There's
one
some
angle,
weird-looking noses.
There are some weird looking noses out there, right? So it's one of these things where there's a lot of potential for content. There's a lot of potential as it gets more standardized. Once again, like, without standards, without hardware standards, it's impossible for any of these things to move forward. So the more, when we talk about getting NPUs in everything, we're going to start seeing some user applications, but then we're going to see some litigation come into it. We've seen disruptions in the entire art process, and we've also, made artists feel pretty, in studios, there are a lot of cases where artists have felt pretty undervalued, and we're also on like a string of a lot of games that have been poorly received that have been hard for artists and other people as well in the wake of all of this. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the industry. There's a lot of worry about where this tech is going, what it means, and also potential, right? Like, anything's potential for, and some things were previously some people's jobs that we don't do anymore. The big difference is the exponential curve of progress, that there is a point where humans just won't be able to keep up anymore. And we've been asked to change more in our lives than any previous generation. And there is a point where we're like, this just isn't human anymore. We can't keep up anymore. There's a point of progress where it's going to be too hard for us. So we have to be mindful of this. How do we make sure that we bring humans along for the ride? That's, in some way or another.
And again, not out of altruism for truckers' jobs or whatever, but just out of like us being happy. Like, are we getting to a point where we have enough abundance, and at a certain point, let's just make sure we actually want to live in this world.
Yeah, exactly. And that it's meaningful to make stuff, right? So like, if you're not able to make anything anymore because everything's being taken that way or trained on, it's going to be what it's going to be. Every game studio that I know of has integrated some aspects of AI in some way or another, at least. The less disrespectful ones have just been like plugging holes until they get the right thing in place. So like, AI generates some dialogue while you get the better scripts to your voice actors, so you don't give your voice actors 3 terrible scripts first.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Right? But maybe that sucks for the voice actors because they like getting the bad ones because they get paid more. I don't know. Like, that's where the ethics comes in.
They can add notes to it. And
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, maybe you still end up needing 3 or 4 steps because of that, but
maybe the steps are higher quality.
Exactly.
Maybe AI makes the first step a second step, but you still add to it and it's better.
Or you generate a cutscene for a placeholder thing where you're just waiting to pull some financial resources to pull $100,000 together to give a studio, right? Like, it's still good to plug a hole rather than black screen here. Imagine, right? Like,
yeah, no, that absolutely. That's better for sure.
Yeah. So it can be really useful for
and
plugging
just put in the
holes.
corner asterisk AI approximation.
Yeah. Like tone setting, not actual content. So it's going to be a bunch of things. I think it's got too many rough corners right now for most big entities to put it in without like ship a product in it, just because there's just too many chances for liability. And I think it's more from a fear of suing rather than anything else, either from people encountering content that the game developer wasn't aware existed in it, or from like finding a way to make things say things that are offensive or whatnot. Like there's going to be some paths for all of these things. And the second that we're putting less and less stuff in the actual creative hands.
All right. I think that is a good place to end the show on once again. I will say it's always at the end, but it's usually there's the people that make it to the end. They usually say this is the best part of the conversation is when we get into AI. So I'm sure they will enjoy that and enjoy it when you come on again. I'm sure to talk about AIs. I'm sure there will always be something over the next 100 years to talk about when it comes to AI. But please, before I let you go, plug whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that right now, just take a look into what's coming in the future from us. Look for announcements or whatnot. Follow me on whatever if you feel like.
I'll have a link to your Twitter account. I'll have a link
if you just Google my name, even if you spell it wrong, you'll find me. So feel free to follow me. Reach out if you have any questions or want to chat. I'm usually down to talk hardware. I have limited.
In the latest game you guys are in early access, there'll be a link to that as well in the description.
Yeah, and feel free to message, as well if you have. Honestly, it's always a pleasure. Feel free, Tom, to have me on any hardware cycle, whatever you want. It's I'm always keeping up to date because I just love that apex of where artistry and technology meet. So I'm watching the space no matter what. And thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And of course, you wouldn't have been on 8 times unless I enjoyed it on my end as well. And of course, everybody, please remember, subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead, ring the bell button, comment below, share this video, and like the video. And of course, support us on Patreon. We can ask guys like Bryan questions, get access to other content like Die Shrink. New one just came out. It's like GPU ranking chart we put all this effort into on Moore's Law is Dead. Probably going to change some of the rankings after seeing how the 5070 and 5070 Ti turn out, actually. Subscribe to Broken Silicon on your podcast app of choice and give us a review there as well. And again, thank you, Bryan, for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for watching and for listening. And have a good week, everybody. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie No Sugad as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie No Sugata as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you.
I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels:
Brad Medlin, Drina Foles, Z Jits, Daniel D, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, MJB1, GZ Ziggy, Toka, SNES Chalmers, Jen Ferreira, Valka Malev, Jensen Wayne, Gregor Sacker, Sarcastro, Chris Rich, Evan Dingle, Compressed AI Blocks, Hal Booma, Shredbird, Sammy Malas, Jordan Simkovic, The Boss Haas, Chrysantine, Jonathan, Franco Frederic, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Neithra Zink, Zlicky, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Jamie Witters, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cakes, Gamers Unite, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, I Should, James Anderson, Mark Raidmaker, Cole Atta, Cameron, Henry Shang, Wesley Sager, Michelle Pell, Hexapuma, Mai Sharona, Reginald Ari, Tika Autumn, Winwing, Winstar, Corey Leonard, James I, Raider, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, JSMMH, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Clinton, Daffy, Stephen Dick, Justin Bussell, Austin Haggerty, Joe Fitt, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Jansen Angema, Joseph Kelly, Slushbot, Himsa Gunk, Tails2299, Sisyphos7771, Brian Wright, The Forbidden Juice, RB Racer, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, Freedy, Jeffrey Gentleman, Michael Cosi, John Swin, Crystal Joe, Elbergun, Keekum, Solarized 80, Thalo215, Brian P, Sprutnik, Hoodat42, Cornster671, Pento Winterhell, Richard Omega Doge, Mr. Tiger, John Wick Boomstick, Hugo, Ander Kiwi, Porcelain Oats, Curry King, 3 Nick Zoosmania, Sakosha State Farm Steak, Rye Hill G Bulls, Kevin Kuntz Stuff, Armin Vakatura, Jonathan Harris, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.